God, reveal your desire for me. God, tell me what you want. Or like, God, humble me. I'm really scared to pray that prayer. I think inevitably it kind of means that you're in for a ride.
Yeah. Hey, so welcome to the show. I'm really happy to have you here today. It's one thing that I really do want to say before we really dive into the conversation is there's a lot of parts of this podcast that I underestimated. And one of the things that I underestimated is honestly how much I've been blessed by the conversations that I've had with everybody. Because not only did I start the podcast for, obviously glorifying God and to try to spread the message, but never did I think that, through just conversations with people about God and stuff like that. Like, I mean, kind of you should already have a notion that this would happen, but like I've been just humbled in so many different ways. You know what I mean? And yeah, it's just been amazing to speak with fellow brothers and sisters in Christ about who God is, what he's done for us, what Jesus has done for us. Through so many different situations, there's a uniqueness in everyone's story, but at the same time, you see how it always comes back full circle and so many different similarities about how God really works in people's lives. So I'm just really excited to hear your story, and just really glad you could join me. So tell me a little bit about yourself, and just let's dive into this conversation.
Yeah. So where do I start? So my name's Sophia. I was born and raised in Richmond, and I graduated from the University of Richmond. I am currently working just a very normal salary job, office job. And, life is life. Nothing crazy is going on right now. Yeah. So I don't know if should I start from my childhood maybe?
I mean, wherever you want to start. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, sure. So my parents are immigrants,
Mm-hmm.
South Korean, and I'm Korean American. But I was born and raised in Richmond, as I mentioned before, and I didn't have such a great childhood, and it's not anything special in the sense that I think everyone's family is sort of broken to an extent, at least. And so it was the same for me. I come from a very broken family. My dad was not. I want to say he wasn't mentally there. And even, now that I have more knowledge on psychology and stuff, because that's what I majored in, I suspect that he has schizophrenia, paranoia, but he's not diagnosed, and I'm not licensed to diagnose or anything. But I suspect that that's what he has, and I think that just mentally he wasn't capable of keeping a family. And so that sort of bled into my growing up. And so, I mean, there's so much that I remember. And I'm sure everyone remembers things from their childhood. Just scenes of their family's brokenness and things like that. And I also have that same those kinds of memories and things, and I think growing up it really affected my perspective. I felt like I couldn't ask for things because I guess I should clarify. So my parents always had a very rocky relationship because of the way my dad is. And I think the crisis hit when my dad just kind of left Like
Oh, wow.
we woke up one morning. Literally, this is how it happened. But we woke up one morning and my dad was not anywhere to be seen. The car was gone.
And how old were you when this happened?
I want to say, I know I was definitely like, I wasn't even 10. I don't think. I don't remember my exact age, but
Oh, wow.
yeah, it was so impressionable that even with all the years that have passed, I still remember, that morning when we woke up and he wasn't there. And my mom, she started getting really worried because she couldn't contact him and stuff. And it turns out he was in Korea. Yeah.
What?
Just overnight, he had gotten a ticket and he's just left.
Wow.
And so
there's like no explanation from him.
Yeah.
Oh.
But he made it sound like, from what I understand, he made it sound like he was going to return very soon. But one day turned into 1 week, 1 week turned into 1 month, and a month turned into a year, and he didn't come back. And during that time, my mom was struggling to provide for us because she's an immigrant mom, very limited English.
Mm-hmm.
And so with the language barrier, the only jobs she could really get were low paying sort of, manual labor type jobs. So like cleaning and things like that. And for my mom also, that was a huge blow to her pride because she grew up just kind of being loved on. She grew up very capable. She was a very talented person. And so, she was actually a manga thingy, an anime person. So
she drew the art for it?
No, so the art would come from Japan, and her company. So I don't know what her company was exactly, but in her company, her position was just like she would color in the background with watercolor. Yeah.
Okay, that's awesome.
I know. Yeah. So she that's like where she came from, and all of a sudden she has to resort to like these cleaning jobs or like things like that. And so it was really hard for her. And we actually used to live in the house next to the church, next to our.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So we used to live there, and what had happened was, so we lived there, and if I remember correctly, I think part of like our contract or whatever was we would take care of like maintenance stuff. So like, mowing the lawn, and my mom would clean the church facilities and things like that. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's my understanding of what happened. And I think when the church found out, and they shall remain anonymous because we both went there. Right. And I do not want to talk badly about other people. That's not the purpose of this. But so after my dad, when they found out that my dad left, basically they were telling my mom, you can't stay here anymore. You need to leave. Oh, wow. Yeah. And my mom is a very prideful woman. She's very strong and stubborn. I think that was like one of her low points, is when she had to beg them to let us stay because, basically, essentially at the root of it, we were facing eviction. Yeah. Yeah. And we had nowhere to go,
But why because your dad left? I don't quite understand why they.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. When I first heard of this, when I was older and my mom told me about this, I was a little angered by this because, this is a church we're talking about, and these are church leaders we're talking about. So, it sounded to me that they had a serious lack of empathy, a serious lack of, compassion,
Yeah.
But one elder told my mom, we don't need a woman to be doing these jobs. So like mowing the lawn, doing yard work and things like that. So I think basically they were sort of pointing out that she might not be as adequate as a man would be in in terms of efficiency.
Yeah.
In those types of jobs. And so
yeah, that's interesting because like why, like first of all, I mean, I get there was probably some sort of contract, yeah, but like when your dad leaves and then yeah, and to your point, like I said, like well, like you said, it's a church, and these are the times that people need their church the most.
Yeah.
And they're talking about some sort of contract negotiation and be like, well, maybe we need to have somebody else fill this contract.
Yeah, and like maybe they were right. Maybe because I was so little, I didn't have the eyes or the experience to judge whether the quality of my mom's work was up to par or not. So maybe they were right. Maybe a man with more experience, with more, strength, like physical strength, would have been more efficient and stuff. But it's like, why does that matter? It's about helping those in need and stuff like that.
Yeah, like hire somebody to do this stuff and then help the people that need help.
Yeah, exactly. So when I first heard about this, properly, when I first properly heard about it, because I was there for I remember when my mom came back just sobbing, and so I remember the general timeline of this event and what had occurred. But when I first heard it properly for the first time, what the dialogue that was exchanged, I was actually kind of angered because of all those things that we talked about just now. But then I think the bigger picture here is that this is not uncommon in terms of churches. I think a lot of churches have the serious problem where they become so fixated on church politics and church technicalities and church structure and stuff that they don't have this they're missing this human aspect, this compassion. And I think that's what that made me realize, is that this is not specific to me and my mom and my sister. It happens in a lot of places in various ways. And so it's a sad reality, I think. Yeah.
I mean, it is a reality, but definitely something that
I know it shouldn't happen.
It shouldn't happen.
Yeah, especially because we're supposed to be biblical, and it's it's very sad. But
so what ended up happening though?
We ended up getting evicted, basically. Yeah, and then after that, we had to live in people's houses.
Went to Wow.
Yeah. So I think a lot of my story is it's like a continuation of my mom's story, because I really think that my mom is so incredible to me in many ways, and I think that's just one reflection of her perseverance. Yeah, because I think if that had happened to me, I would have left. I would have been so discouraged, so hurt by the church, and I would have left. But my mom recognized that people are flawed, even church leaders, and her job is simply to remain faithful to God, and not be swayed by human flaws, human imperfections, human mistakes. And I think, that was that left a very strong impression. But yeah, for a while, I think a little less than maybe 3 years or so, we were kind of just living in other people's houses. They had graciously allowed us to live there. for a fee or something like that. And during that time, it was so hard because the people who allowed us to live with them, they weren't Christian, and so they would cheat my mom of like her money, her services, like take advantage of the fact that my mom is kind of indebted to them. And for my mom, that was another blow to like her pride, and in a lot of ways, I think for her this was a very humbling experience. And for me, I felt like growing up, I felt like I couldn't ask my mom for things. I actually don't remember asking my mom for anything of significance, like
yeah, you understood her struggle from an early age.
Yeah.
And, that's something that not many kids in their households learn until they're much older.
Yeah.
Like so many kids are just kind of like, you have to teach them that value of money doesn't grow on trees. It's like, Mom, Dad, I want this, I want that. And you had to learn at a very early age what it meant to understand the type of sacrifices that your parents are making for you, or the situations that your parents get into.
Right.
And, even for me, like I didn't understand that for a long time. So like,
yeah, well, I would hear stuff, overhear conversations between my mom and the homeowner, for example, and they would argue about like the money aspect, and even at that age, I could tell they were sort of cheating her of her money. But my mom having no choice but to sort of acquiesce because, otherwise we might face eviction again. And for my mom, that wasn't really an option. So it was unreasonable, but it was just the way things were at the time. And so I remember, this is when I was in elementary school, but I remember there were a couple times here and there where I would run out of lunch money, but I couldn't tell my mom. And so I would just not have lunch.
Oh,
yeah.
Wait, this was in elementary school? They didn't provide free lunch?
So they would provide free lunch, but it was just like, 2 slices of bread and like a piece of cheese in between.
What the heck?
Yeah. So whenever I ran out of money, it was like 3 or 4 times or something like that. I would just like, I couldn't ask my mom. And then I would just end up eating that for lunch. And it was kind of sad, but I was like, oh, I can't ask my mom. And it's not like, when we talk about this as like adults, it's like, it's so sad, like if a kid told me that, I'd be like, I'll pay for your lunch, like, but at the time when I was a kid, it wasn't even like, oh, this is so sad, I have to eat this, and like I don't have money. It was just a matter of fact for me. It like, even looking back now, it was kind of shocking where my mindset was. And I think like the environment really does play a part in how like children are shaped and stuff like
absolutely.
that.
Yeah, like there's this one. I don't know exactly what the context of it was, but there are these 2 short commentaries where they ask a bunch of little kids, and one is in first world country, and I think a lot of it was from the United States.
Yeah.
And then the other is from third world countries, and they ask them, what is the one thing you want most in life? And everybody in the US, all the kids, it's like, oh, I want money. I want like
really kids.
Yeah, wow. Like, I want $1,000 or something like and just something monetary or not out of necessity or anything like that. And then they ask the kids in the third world country who are struggling to get by on a daily basis, and every day is just a means of survival for them. They're asking they're asked the question, well, what do you want the most? And like, oh, I wish I could have some meat.
Oh,
I wish I could have like just basic things that we take for granted on any given day that we just Oh, I want a steak. Okay, let me go to Kroger and just
Yeah.
buy a steak.
Yeah.
And then we'll complain about just random things like, oh,
Yeah.
like this steak isn't that good,
Mm-hmm.
and just we take so much of this stuff for granted sometimes,
Mm-hmm.
and
That's
I
right.
think
Yeah.
to your point, yeah, like everything about how your culture and society kind of shapes your understanding
Mm-hmm.
of what it means to be grateful for something, what it means to actually understand like what your basic necessities are versus just outside of that,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
I think kids have a much clearer understanding of that when
Yeah.
they go through these types of struggles.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't think it was I mean, yeah, it makes sense that it was matter of fact. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
even, well, I guess some kids probably would
Mm-hmm.
be still spoiled in these situations and just be like,
Yeah.
oh, how come these kids have it and I don't? So,
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure I was like, like envious, but there was just this, I think children are very simple. It's very black or white to them. So for me, it was like, oh, we don't have money, I guess.
mhm.
I don't have money for lunch. That's it. That's the end of that. And I can't ask my mom because she doesn't have any money. So, and that's kind of just how I grew up. I just felt like I couldn't put extraneous burden on my mom when she was already struggling with so much. And I grew up, and I like told this to my mom too, and she thought it was really sad and she felt so bad. But it's just like, I don't think she should feel bad for this because it wasn't in her control. But I literally watched my mom. I literally grew up watching my mom cry,
Mhm.
and in prayer, but not like, oh dear God, thank you for this wonderful day. It was very like sorrowful prayer every time,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that's how I grew up at that time period. We like there's a lot of in depth that I feel like is kind of unnecessary, but essentially, like, we got evicted, like we got like kicked out, several times after that by these homeowners. And it wasn't even like, I need you to leave in like so and so amount of time. It was more like, they scammed us and then we would part ways.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it was so tumultuous, financially and just like relationally, and for my mom, it's just everything. And my mom was dealing with so much stress that it actually triggered diabetes.
Oh, I didn't
Yeah.
know stress could do that.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
didn't know either. But
Wow.
I remember she would be so tired sometimes, just falling asleep, just anywhere. And she would also come home, and the first thing she would do was like down like 5 bottles of water. So
Mm.
she was like, I'm so thirsty, and she felt like something was abnormal. So she got checked out, and it turned out it was diabetes. And what the doctor told her was, I think you're dealing with a lot of stress, and so that probably triggered your diabetes. And
Mhm.
so, you know, um, her physical health was deteriorating, and there was just so many things she was just struggling with. And like 3 years into this, my dad called us
Mhm.
like out of nowhere again, and he was like, I'm back, yeah, I know.
What?
Yeah, so he was staying with my grandparents, his parents. And he was like, I'm back, I came back from Korea. And so my mom went to see him, and um you know, obviously she was very resentful. She was like, how could you do this? And I remember like this huge argument, this huge back and forth between my dad and my mom. And me and my sister, like, we didn't want to deal with that. That's not
Yeah.
our problem. So we kind of would just lock ourselves into a room and try to distract ourselves. And that was a norm after that, from that period onwards, because my mom and dad would argue so much. And I'm talking about, these weren't like normal arguments, you know. These aren't normal couple arguments. Like they were violent. Like I still remember my mom was so aggravated to the point where she just punched our glass door at the time, and her hand was just like bleeding.
Oh wow.
And another example is like my dad and my mom were arguing so ferociously, and my dad disappeared into the kitchen. And I thought he left to cool down, but he came back with 2 kitchen knives in his hands, and he started approaching my mom, and I just kind of jumped in there, and I was like, "No, Dad, no!" And I like grabbed the knives with my hands, and I still have a scar on my middle finger on my left hand from that.
Wow, what the
Yeah,
heck?
I know. Yeah, so it was, and that's how I grew up. You know, it was not okay.
Yeah.
It was definitely not okay. So, you know, even when my dad came back, he was very unpredictable. He was very unreliable as a father figure.
And he was never diagnosed officially?
No, yeah.
So he wasn't medicated at all during this time?
No, yeah. And I think part of that is just cultural, you know? Like, I think older generations of Asian families, they don't really talk about mental awareness and stuff.
They refuse
Yeah,
to,
exactly. Yeah. And so
therapy is like the worst possible thing you could ever do.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's like, what? You're mentally insane. It's like, what? No. But yeah, so I don't think that even crossed our minds, you know, the possibility of my dad being mentally disabled or or something like that, you know. So so even after my dad returned, it was just really hard, you know, growing up. And that was my dad lived with us until my high school years. So it wasn't, because I'm only 24. It wasn't too far back.
Yeah.
And and so that was my family situation. But even amidst all that, you know, I was sort of dealing with a lot of stuff myself. I was being bullied at school, which I don't talk to a lot of people about because it makes them uncomfortable. I don't know why, but you know, it's a very hard subject. And so I was being bullied at school. I was being, you know, sexually harassed, and, you know, I would say assaulted even.
And this was at school?
It was at school, yeah.
Like by a student, like a classmate?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. What the heck?
Yeah. Yeah, so, you know, like, for example, like, there was a guy, this is so ridiculous to think about, but there was a guy who every time I stood up, because he sat next to me in class, he would reach over and grab my butt, you know? Yeah. And
wait, how old were y'all when this was going on?
So that guy, I was in 7th grade. So I think maybe 13-ish.
Let's see. That's when like he needs somebody to just really smack the crap. Like, 'cause, I mean, you know, that's like their puberty years, their testosterone's going through the roof. Like that's really when you need a good smack in the face. Like, just know your place, man. Oh my goodness, like that's ridiculous.
Yeah, it was bad because especially it wasn't even just that one action alone that really discouraged me or just like, you know, pressed down on me. But, you know, like whenever he did that, all the other students, even like girls, you know, I don't think girls are any less guilty. They would like kind of snigger and like laugh at me and like make fun of me. And then that would become like the talk of the town, so to speak.
What was the teacher doing at this point?
teacher didn't notice, and because I was so timid, I felt like I couldn't say anything. And another reason why actually I became that timid is actually because of the lack of response from adults. So that wasn't even the worst instance. I think one of the worst middle school instances, not high school instances, was there was a guy. I still remember his first and last name. I'm
Call
like,
him out.
no, I will not expose him. I hope he has become a better person. And like now that I'm older, I know that like kids are kids. They really need to be taught so well because like you said, there's a lot of biological stuff going on, and like sometimes they do stuff and they don't know what they're doing. They just do stuff because they feel like it. But anyway, sorry. There was a guy who, had apparently developed an interest for me, and he was like, go out with me. And I was like, no, I'm good. And he was so persistent, like physically too. Like he would like force me to hold hands with him. Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
What the heck?
He would like grab my waist and like force me to like walk with him and stuff. Even if I tried to like push him away.
Yeah.
And then after like half a year of just him trying to force himself on me, he started getting really frustrated. And so he would say things like, if you don't say you'll go out with me by 8 p.m. tonight, I'm going to kill myself, or like I'm going to shoot myself. Yeah. So
what the heck?
And it was like, I don't know about other kids, but at the time, at that age, I was super naive. So when he said stuff like that, I was so scared out of my mind. I was like, do I need to go out with this guy? Like, is that what it takes for him to not say?
I mean,
like,
that's
what
total
if
manipulation.
Yeah. I was like, what if someone dies because I refuse them, But, several instances happen. And eventually I was like, okay, so he's not actually going to do it. But it was still really scary. And I remember one time we had home ec together, which is, I don't know if you've ever had like home ec. It's like that class where they teach you how to like cook and like sew and things like just like home stuff.
I remember hearing about it. I've never taken that class, so
yeah. I ended up taking it. He was in that class, unfortunately.
Do you think he took it because you were in there?
I don't know. I don't think so. I actually think it's the other way around, where I think because we took the class together, he ended up liking me.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But I remember one time we were learning how to operate the sewing machines, and when I got up to get more fabric, he turned the sewing machine all the way up. And so when I sat down, I literally almost sewed my fingers together. Like it was just like da, 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 and I was like
this kid sounds maniacal.
He gave me a lot of trauma at the time. It was really scary. And I was scared of him. And so things like that. And in high school, it actually got worse, because I think at that age, it's like, guys or, boys, they don't really know what they're doing, and they don't know any better. But in high school, that's when I think kids start knowing what they want, and their actions slowly start becoming more intentional. And
I mean, don't give them credit for that in middle school. Like, you know what I mean? Like, yes, there's a certain level of their childhood aspect that they make mistakes, but a lot of the ways that kids shape themselves in middle school directly correlates to how they are in high school. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
you're right.
So
I'm just trying to just give them the benefit of the doubt, because I'm like, oh, when I was a kid, I didn't know any better. But no, I definitely agree that those aren't excusable actions. Oh yeah, and I forgot to mention, I got so scared at one point that I actually approached I think a counselor, and she was like, okay, let me talk to him. Nothing happened. He actually just got more upset because he found out that I had, tattled on him and stuff. And so things actually got exacerbated. And so after that point, I felt like I couldn't tell anyone because this notion of help is just, it's unreliable, it's an illusion kind of mentality for me. Yeah. And then in high school, and mind you, this is all happening in tandem with all the family stuff too. So
yeah, like you're dealing with all this nonsense with stupid kids at school. On top of that, you're having like this experience where, like, to your point, what you said earlier, you are supposed to be able to view adults as some sort of security net in these types of situations and be like, okay, well, if I feel this way, I can go to an authority and that authority will handle this situation. But not only are you struggling with that from the family realm, but then you go to a counselor and then they don't do anything about it. Like that's rough. Like,
it was really rough. And I still remember too, when I was little, I was very daring. I was super extroverted and outgoing. And I would I would talk big and stuff and like, oh, I got this and that, But slowly but surely even now I can just kind of envision how I slowly started becoming more timid and more insecure about, who I was, and my presence.
Yeah.
And also how others perceive me. I felt like people didn't like me, I felt like that was a default. Yeah. And, in high school, there was one guy, there are two specific instances. There was one guy who was really creepy. I don't know how else to put it, but he was so creepy. He would try to force me to spend time with him. One time he because we had the same lunch period. My gosh, that was horrible. But he would sit next to me and he'd be like, "What are you eating?" And just snatch it out of my hand and take a bite out of it. And then he would force me to eat it after him, Yeah, so that was really gross. The same guy, he tried to enter the locker room when I was the only one in there, the girls' locker room.
What the heck?
Yeah, I remember in gym class, I had to leave early, so I had to get up. Everyone else was sitting down, and I asked the gym teacher to open the locker door for me so I could access my stuff and leave.
Yeah.
When I was in the locker room, I heard someone trying to open the door. The doorknob was rattling. So I actually went to go unlock it because I just assumed it was another girl.
Yeah.
But then the guy started speaking. He was like, "Sophia, I know you're in there. Open up." And I got so scared. I actually exited through the back. Yeah.
Dang,
he was
these
so scary.
Creepy dudes like that? What is going on right now? Oh my gosh.
I know, yeah. And another reminder that this is probably not that uncommon of an experience, But and then, there were other times when these guys would follow me and be like, "Hey, my friend over there, he thinks you're pretty cute, you want to go home with us?" I was like, "Oh no, I'm sorry, I have to go home." He's like, "Are you sure?" And he said some really sexually explicit things to me.
Yeah.
And he was like, "Are you sure? We do," and
right.
That was so scarring for me too. I don't know why. But it was really scarring. And just in general, that was just how I was. And I had no friends. I had 2 friends.
Right.
But it was hard to call them friends because I had such a deep I had a very deep understanding of relationships in general. So for me, a friend wasn't someone who I would just talk to about common interests and stuff. A friend was someone who would make me feel more fulfilled,
Right.
Someone who would really be willing to sacrifice certain things for me, you know? And it's hard to find actual friendships like that or just relationships like that in general. And so I was really lonely. I remember these things I was dealing with at the time. I had tried to talk to my mom about it. And I still remember, this is the first and last time I ever talked to her about it during that time. I told my mom like about the incident where the guy forced me to eat. It was a burrito. I still remember. And I told my mom, and I was like in tears, you know, because I was like, oh, my mom will understand and stuff. I still remember her response was, are you stupid? Yeah. She was like, are you stupid? You know, why didn't you get up and, you know, slap him in the face? Like, why didn't you defend yourself? Like, you need to be more assertive. And that was the end of the conversation. And now I know why she responded the way she did. You know, she was dealing with a lot of stuff. You know, just because my dad came back and we were slightly more financially stable, it didn't mean that everything was all peachy and sunshine, you know. My mom was going through a lot, and I think just out of so much pent up frustration, that was just her default response to anything, was just frustration, you know.
Right.
So even with me, you know, I'm sure she was concerned somewhere, but it was more like, you know, frustration that I wasn't able to defend myself or prevent that from happening. And so I never talked to my mom again about the issues that I was having. I tried to talk to my sister one time, and I also started crying there. And my sister's response was, if you're going to cry, can you get out of my room and cry? And because I had initiated, you know, a handful of times and nothing worked out, I ended up becoming super timid. I cannot tell anyone about my problems. I'll end up just getting more hurt.
Right.
And not in college, in high school, that ended up becoming, you know, it was a really dark time for me, because I started developing like a very bad case of depression. It was to the point where I had started having suicidal ideations. I would literally just hold myself up in my closet. I just sit there and start thinking about, like, you know what? If I just killed myself, would people then start thinking about me and like saying things like, oh, you know, I should have been nicer to her, you know? Or like, oh, you know, Sophia, like, I kind of miss her, you know? And it was just things like that. Like, that's just how I was at the time. And even at church, I didn't really have friends. I remember getting bullied a lot.
In church?
Yeah.
What is going on? Like, oh my goodness.
Yeah, I don't know.
I'm getting mad for you right now.
Yeah, it was bad.
Like, did you have a lot of kids around your age at church?
Yes and no. They were all 1 year older than me, so my sister's like, she's almost a year older. She's 164 days older than I am. So we're Irish twins, and they were all in her age group, more specifically. But we were in the same general age group. It's just that, you know, when you're younger, 1 year matters a lot. So if you're like if you're like in 8th grade and someone's in 9th grade, it's like, I'm in middle school and they're in high school. It's like, they're so old.
Hold on. You said your sister is 164 days?
Sorry, did I say that? I meant to say 364 days.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I was like, how does that work?
No, 364.
Oh, okay. Yeah. I was like, did I miss something about it?
No, it was probably me.
Okay. So I just wanted to clarify. I was like, maybe I just learned something completely new about twins.
No. Like, what? Wait, year is.
Okay, go ahead.
No, yeah. So yeah, like, you know, I don't want to talk badly of my sister, because I'm like, at the same time that I was going through these, so was she. She was right there with me, you know?
Yeah.
But my sister has always been very humorous, super extroverted. So she always had a lot of friends. And I think because I didn't have friends and I felt like I couldn't make friends, I always sort of gravitated towards her. And then, you know, inevitably I'd be gravitated towards her friends because she was constantly hanging around her friends. And so I think my sister saw that as an annoyance or a disturbance. And she didn't like that. So it was this, I think it was kind of the same at church, because most of the people in my age group, quote unquote, they were actually more specifically in her grade, you know? And so they were kind of like more her friends. And I was just that annoying little sibling that like kind of trails along. And so, you know, I still remember a lot of hurtful words that were said to me. I still remember one time they were planning to do a skit and like record it and stuff just for funsies. And I wanted to be a part of that, you know? So I was like, oh, can I do this? Can I do this? And I remember one guy, he was like, no, can you just shut up? And so I started crying.
And this is in church.
Yeah, this is in church. So I started crying and he was like, why are you crying? You know, like, it's so annoying. You don't like, why are you crying? There's no reason for you to be crying. And this was like when all the kids were watching, you know, because it was so awkward then. It was just like awkwardly silent. And he was just kind of like, you know, talking down to me and stuff like that. And, you know, it was just this and that. And in church, I was also sexually harassed towards my high school years. It was pretty gross.
What the heck?
Yeah, I mean, youth group boys, you know?
Yeah.
And it's not worth, I mean, it wasn't that distinct from like school. It was definitely more verbal than it was physical at church, but it was still very like, you know, it was kind of like deep down, I think I was kind of infuriated that I felt like I couldn't do anything, you know? And yeah, so, you know, in high school, that's when I started really realizing that I am struggling with this inferiority, you know, like I have no sense of like I was just really timid, I guess.
Yeah.
You know? And I think because I had no confidence in who I was, I couldn't say no. I couldn't be assertive about certain things. And I was just really depressed about who I was and all that was happening. I think I found a lot of solace in academics. And so I started studying a lot to the point where it became an obsession, really. And I became so absorbed in becoming smart, you know, excelling academically and stuff. And, you know, I think around 6th grade, that's when I started really reading the Bible and stuff. And then into my high school years, I started thinking about what the Bible meant to me and who Christ was to me. But at the same time that I found a lot of comfort and solace in Jesus Christ and the Word of God, I also found a lot of solace in how being good at academics made me feel as a person and to other people, in other people's eyes, you know? So I think, you know, in very generally put, I think that school became a sort of idol, you know, good grades. Getting into a good college was like a really big hope of mine.
Right.
Yeah. And I think around my junior year and senior year, I had a really, really bad I don't know what to say. It was just a really bad event with that. It involved a church leader, my youth leader at the time. Like my youth, what do you call it? In Korean, it would be 전도사님. I don't know what you would call them.
Yeah, they're not like a pastor or anything.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just
like,
the youth leader, I think is best way to put it. Yeah.
Youth leader, youth director.
Yeah, youth director. Yeah.
Yeah. So, he was very manipulative. Now that I look back at it, he shall also remain anonymous. But he was very manipulative. And he would, first of all, he would spend way too much time with me. And I was a minor, so towards my senior year, it started getting a little concerning because, he would say stuff like, oh, my girlfriend is jealous of you. Or like, if I were your age, I'd get married to you. Like things that are like inappropriate for a youth director to say to
inappropriate for anybody to say this to a minor. Like what?
Yeah. So I started getting a little disturbed.
You were in high school,
junior to senior. So I was like 17. I think I was 16 when he first started.
So this was like what, like 7-8 years ago?
Oh gosh, is it really like that? I guess so.
It's not that long.
Yeah. No, I guess it just feels so long when you put it that way. But yeah, it was, yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, or was it? No, I think it was. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, but he was weird. And he would do stuff that would make me seriously uncomfortable. Like he would so if I told him like, oh yeah, like he would be like, oh, what are you doing this week? And I would say like, oh, I'm meeting up with our EM pastor, right, to just sort of talk about things and not. He would intentionally be like, why don't you hang out with me instead? Like, and so I'd be like, oh, but I already told him I would, meet with him. And he'd be like, no, don't meet with him. Just come with me. And he would pressure me into saying yes. And so eventually I would not be able to speak with our EM pastor. And I only spent time with him. Like almost like I would even go so far as to say like 4 days of the week were like me spending time with him. Anytime he called me, minimum like 2 hours, and it's just of him talking.
Wait, how old was this dude?
He was in his early 30s. Yeah. Yeah.
He got fired, right?
No, not exactly. I'll get to that. It's such a tragedy, but yeah, he would spend time talking to me for a really long period of time, and most of it was just him talking trash about the other youth kids or the other youth moms, which was wildly inappropriate,
What is the point of this youth director even having a job at this church? Yeah. Like he's supposed to direct the youth.
Well, the thing is, I think he was only really like that to me. So nobody else saw this version of him except for me. And at the time I was really naive and I was also very lenient. And so I just kept giving him the benefit of the doubt, and I would kind of just, because also he was very manipulative. He made me feel bad about, like, for instance, if he would say, he would also gossip a lot about our pastors at the time. And if I didn't agree with him, he would become so visibly upset. And he would also start talking trash to other people. So, one instance that still really strikes me today is I remember one time during a lock-in or like a mini retreat, if you will, he called all the little youth student leaders together and held a meeting, quote unquote, and he would say stuff like, "Oh yeah, like, that girl, yeah, she was talking when I was preaching. I got so upset, like, why even come here? I wanted to get up and smack her in the face. And like that girl that recently started coming out to church, I want to be like, why even come out? Like, just at this point, like, if you're not gonna commit to Christ, like, just stop coming out. What's the point? I want to tell her to stop." He would say things like that. And so, that was like the first time that I ever confronted him. And I was like, like, I agree with you. It's frustrating when people don't change the way you want them to, or, they don't change on schedule, quote unquote. But I think that it's a different story when you're verbalizing this to the people under you. Like, first of all, I think that as people who should be preaching about the love of Christ, right, and the gospel, I don't think it's very authentic and believable when secretly we're harboring all this hatred for the people that we're preaching to.
Yeah, it's the opposite of what the gospel is.
Exactly, yeah. And I told him, I also don't think it's right for us to determine who can come out to church or not. I think it's amazing that this person is coming out. Like, just the fact that they're coming out, by some grace of God, they're able to hear the gospel. I think that's amazing. And that's a starting point. And like you said, it's only been a couple of months since they started coming out. We can't expect people to change so radically. And after that, he actually went around talking to people about me and how I yelled at him is what he said. So after all this, I became very uncomfortable with how my relationship with him was. He's a church leader and I'm being led. So I told our EM pastor.
Led astray, like,
almost. So I told our church leader at the time, and I told him, I told our EM pastor at the time, and I told him, what was happening, and I told him I would prefer to keep this small, and that you guide our conversation, and so that we can reconcile. But he felt responsible as our pastor, and rightly so, to bring it up to the session. And so it blew up, and I was so scared that when they interviewed us, I basically took the fall. I said, you know what? I think I over-exaggerated. And that it was kind of a mistake on my part. And so, long story short, I took the blame. He left on really good terms after that. I don't think he felt like he could stay there after that. But I remember, youth students, and
so he left shortly after all this happened?
Yeah, very shortly, like almost immediately. I would say, several weeks at most.
Well, good. Hopefully he understood that, like, not only did he get to keep his reputation, but like the person that absolutely had every right to pretty much be like, yeah, I'm throwing you straight under this bus.
Yeah, I hope he's a better person now, and I hope he's matured more spiritually. But at the time, because because I was already feeling at my lowest, very insecure, and just not very confident of myself. Now I felt so resentful towards him because and also I felt so much resentment towards myself because I regretted not telling the truth when I had the chance. And it would have been doing him a favor too, honestly, because some people need to learn from their mistakes. And, there were a lot of rumors about me, basically, youth moms and youth students alike. I'm pretty sure the church, like to this day, I'm pretty sure there are a lot of people who still think oh, sorry, I shouldn't have said his name, but him leaving. Could you edit that out?
I got you.
Him leaving was my fault. There were people who like actually approached me afterwards and confessed to me like, like I did resent you for like his leaving. I felt like it was kind of like your fault. And then I found out that he actually went around talking about me to all the youth group moms and basically like made me out to be a delinquent. Like, I don't know how it got to that point. I'm not saying I was a model student, but I don't think I was a delinquent. And so why am I saying all this? I'm saying all this to say that I was at an all-time low. There was no aspect or space in my life where I felt like I truly could stand upright as myself, where I felt like I belonged, where I felt whole. Church, family, school, even in my own room, I just felt so empty. Yeah, so jaded and so small. And at the time, I did have a relationship with Jesus, and I kept telling myself like, it's okay, because Jesus, he was probably the loneliest man alive at one point. His disciples, friends that he had spent so much time with and lived with, ate with, they betrayed him, and compared to Jesus, this is nothing. I shouldn't complain. I shouldn't say anything like that, or and that was just my mindset.
Right.
I think I poured my soul into academics. And actually that failed me because I was so confident that I would be able to like go to a college of my choice, but actually every college that I applied to rejected me. Even, like VCU, they have an acceptance rate of like 75% or something like that. I'm not saying that like VCU is not a good school, but I'm saying even considering their acceptance rate, I didn't even get in. And, like I would like to think that like, I was, like just very objectively, I think that like my stats as a student, they were pretty good. They were in a good place. There was no reason, like when I think about it, for me to have gotten rejected from literally every school that I applied to. But I felt like such a failure. And when my very last hope crushed me, like when it collapsed, I think that was my turning point. And I realized that like, wow, this is the end. I have nothing going for me. Absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
And I spent like a couple of months just sort of really depressed and down in the dumps. And by some miracle of God, one day I was like, you know what? I have to get back up at some point, and it might as well be sooner rather than later. So I kind of promised myself that I'm going to take a gap year or a gap semester. I don't remember. But during that time, literally all I'm going to do is devote myself to God. I'm just going to read the Bible. I'm just going to pray. I'm going to praise. I'm going to serve my church. That's all I'm going to do. And that's literally all I did. And that was one of the most amazing, most fruitful seasons of my life. And that, I think as a Christian, I think that was a huge turning point for me in my faith journey. Yeah, and throughout college and even until now, it's just been a journey of healing, of finding a sense of self and self-identity in Christ, and me being able to forgive and let go of everyone who hurt me, including myself. And the things that I had been hurt by, for instance, like me not being able to ask for things, I think that changed too, because you have to ask God for things. You're unreliable, like yourself is unreliable.
Mm-hmm.
You're unqualified to do anything, you know.
Yeah.
But it's God who qualifies us, and so I have no choice but to ask God for things. And when I experienced for the first time my requests being answered, that's when I started gaining confidence that if I ask, there will be a response,
Mm-hmm.
a good response, you know. And for the first time, I learned what it was like to have a father. And that was very life altering as well, because I grew up without a good father presence. And so I never fully understood or could comprehend what having a good father figure was like. So anytime I read stuff like that in the Bible, it didn't mean much to me. And just things like that, I think I really found myself. I think I was able to really recover, and not only recover, but like beyond recovery, just the amount of like blessings that I've received, and not necessarily like monetarily or like physically or stuff or relationally, but just like in terms of my spirit, I think has been very incredible. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's wild. Like, I mean, we spoke obviously a little bit more than briefly last week before we met up for the interview today. And, we kind of skimmed over some of the topics. And,
Yeah.
but like, it's actually incredible. Like hearing your story right now, it's like, so you're starting out like as this kid, like because I can relate a lot to the dysfunctional family aspect of it.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
In terms of like, it's like there are days when you walk into the house and you can there's just like weird aura in the air that you can just feel. You're like, oh, today's gonna be a bad day, like, and stuff like that. I can kind of relate to that, but like, and like not only from the familial aspect, but like every, I think, immigrant or Asian person somewhat gets bullied at school, but
yeah.
then there's a different level of bullying. So it's like there's a certain level of relatability, but at the same time, like I don't, I guess, consider myself like a timid person. I'm not. I would say I'm pretty introverted, but in terms of timidness, like that's something that like I just didn't want to be. So I would lash out a lot more. But like being in that aspect of just not being able to kind of assert your feelings in certain situations, and then not having the authority figures to kind of give you that support and that structure. And then not to mention all the stuff that this is happening with the church that you're going to.
Yeah.
And the church that from the very beginning kind of let y'all down as a family. And like, I'm at like, it's just, this is the amazing part of this story is that like anybody else, I'd be waiting. Cause I know from our discussion, that like you always kind of maintain that faith, and that eventually you truly came to seek God. But any other story that I hear on this type of, I'll just be like, oh, so what's the point she leaves, right? And
well,
and so, but like your story,
yeah,
it's just like there are two ways you can take into consideration at that low point in your life. And it really reminds me a lot about the story of Job.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yeah. Continue, please.
Yeah. Like, it's, obviously Job is, and I talked a little bit about Job's story in my last episode, but I think it's such an important concept to understand about like what suffering is in life. And there's a lot of parts of that book that even to this day for me, like I missed out on a lot of until I really started to read again and just come to a better understanding of what was actually happening in that story. And a lot of times, like we go through these struggles in life and we're kind of either blaming our surroundings or situation or whatever it may be. And you get to this really low point and there's two options that you really have, especially in terms of as a believer, is that you can either say, you know what, I'm done. God, I've had enough. And I choose to walk away. Or there's that other option where it's, God, like, I trust you. Like, I'm still pissed.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to walk away from this. Like, obviously there are facets to how Job gets there because he's saying some ridiculous stuff throughout a lot of the books. And, you know, he's trying to protect his innocence from those three friends, so-called friends.
Yeah, that's right.
That are pretty much telling him, Job, the reason this is happening to you is because you're a terrible person.
Exactly. Yeah.
You're a sinner. Like, repent to God. Like, and relatively, Job was a pretty righteous man, you know, comparatively, obviously, to Jesus Christ. Like, nobody pales in comparison, but like Job was a fairly righteous man, the most righteous of them all, according to God himself. And, you know, yes, he does get resentful, but I think the main takeaway from that is that he's taking his burdens to God.
Yeah.
He's not saying all this. And I think there's a story to be learned from that is that in these situations, understand that it's not God that's doing this. Sometimes, like, there are things that he allows to happen.
Yeah.
But the enemy is at work in a lot of situations. And how you can respond to that is a very crucial aspect of how you move forward in life. And the key takeaway from Job, I think, to really understand in these situations is don't do what Job did.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, ultimately what he did, do that, but get there faster.
Sure.
Like, stop telling God, like, I'm in, you know, just, but on the flip side, instead of walking away from God entirely, also understand that if you do act like Job, that's still okay.
Yeah.
Like, rather do that, what Job did, than walk away from God.
Yeah.
You know, and maintaining that faith. And like, your story is just like being able to, at one of the lowest points in your life, being able to have this notion of being able to get back up. And one of your first instincts is to go to the scripture and the Bible, and you decide to devote your life to, you know, it's,
well, yeah, I think that's the thing is like, I think I am so grateful for my natural temperament and my natural personality, because I think that, yes, God loves everyone, right, equally, and God's desire is for everyone to come to Christ, right? And that's biblical, you know. It says that in the Bible, but I think in 2 Timothy, maybe. I'm so bad with memorizing, but I think that there's something about people who don't have to resort to this roundabout way of getting to know God, who are just very, very doted on by God, if you will, you know. And so for me, I think that, and this kind of ties back to Job. Job, actually, the first time I properly read Job was when I determined to devote myself to God. That one gap semester or year that I took, and it changed my whole perspective on everything that I had dealt with up to so far in life. Right. You know, all the sufferings that I had ever gone through. Reading Job really brought peace into my heart, because I realized that, like, you know, from like a very human perspective, it's like, how could God allow that to happen to Job? You know, it's not even like Job was like, a heathen or like, a non-believer, or like he was very faithful to God, And so it's just like, how could God allow evil to happen into the life of a quote unquote innocent, And we hear that all the time. It's like, how could God allow this to happen to these people, et cetera,
Mm-hmm.
But, when Job has this very long, like questioning God time. I don't even remember what chapter it goes up to, but
like chapter, I think 32. He's like goes on for like 20 some chapters.
Something like that. Yeah. He just keeps going and going, and but when God finally responds, and God is like, who do you think you are? Basically, like, were you there when I laid down the foundations of the earth? Like, you don't know anything. You don't know what I have planned for you, or what my purposes are,
Mm-hmm.
How could you question me? And so when God finishes, then Job's response is, you're right. I don't know any, I had only heard of you by the ear, but now my eyes have seen you.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I read Job's response for the first time, I'm like tearing up right now, but like, oh man, that made me realize that like, Job's suffering, right? It was a testament of how much God loved him, because he allowed these sufferings, because he wanted Job to get that much closer to him. And I realized that was the same of my life. It's like, I only experienced all these hardships the way I experienced them because it was God's will for me to know him more. And that was a testament that God loved me so much, so dearly,
Yeah.
And when I realized that all my sufferings weren't to put me down or make me feel bad or, put me at a loss, but instead it was a plus, I think that really changed my perspective on what suffering is as a Christian, and what it should be about. I think without Christ, right? And even with Christ, sometimes a lot of our default thinking is to be like, oh, why is this happening to me? Like, why did I have to lose that? Or why did I have to go through that? Why is everyone else happy and I'm not, right?
Yeah.
I think it shouldn't be that kind of thinking, that kind of mentality. I think it should be like, wow, thank you, God. This is an opportunity for me to know you better, for me to draw nearer to you,
Mm-hmm.
And in that time of suffering, I think we need to lean into what God wants from us, what God is expecting from us. And we need to lean into his word. That needs to become a season of prayer, right? And we need to take that as a sign that this is the time.
Yeah.
This is the time to really delve into the word and things like that. So
yeah, no, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I talk about this, actually, I think I talk about this way too much on this show, but I think it's so important to really accentuate this point because, like a lot of times too in the Christian communities, you talk about how you spread the gospel, and a lot of it's based on the prosperity aspect of it, that you believe in God, then good things are going to happen to you, blessings are going to come your way. And even like what you were saying earlier, I think there's a point that you were making, but I want to make sure it's crystal clear to the listeners that when you say that you're praying for things to God because you need to pray to him for things, you're not praying to God expecting him to answer you the way that you want him to answer you.
Yeah.
It's you understanding that God will give you a response, a good response, but that response might not necessarily make you feel good.
No.
But it is what is good for you. It is what is
Yeah.
necessary in your life to bring you closer to God.
Yeah.
And like we have this notion of, oh, well, kind of like Job's friends and their misunderstanding of who God is, that the only way God would let this happen or be making this happen in your life is because you're a terrible person or you did something wrong. But then not quite understanding that grander design of And even, obviously, I don't think we could completely lay out any sort of real, like, comprehensive way to have anybody truly understand the exact purposes of why God allowed that to happen.
Yeah.
But there are a couple themes, but such as how much of our love for God is based on transactions.
Yeah.
And Tim Keller said this really well, and I watched a sermon about this a few weeks back during Bible study. And the reason the devil goes to him is because Satan approaches God and he says, "Have you seen Job? He is the most righteous man on that's walking."
Yeah.
And he's like, "Well, he's not that righteous. Like, why do you think he loves you? Like, look at everything you gave to him." And he allows him to take everything away. But then what does Job say? The Lord gives, but he can take away.
Yeah.
I will worship the name of the Lord my God. And I'm like, what?
I know.
Like, what?
Yeah.
Like, you just lost everything. You lost everything. Your kids die. And that is the response you give. It's like, that's wild.
Yeah, it is.
And then Satan goes back. He's like, actually, all right. It's like, you can take away his stuff. Take away his health, though.
Yeah.
And then he will surely curse you. And that's obviously when he does go through a little bit more of a mental struggle. But like that story is just so powerful. And it's crazy how there are so many people that can take this story and feel so much comfort from it. Because if you really read it from just a objective standpoint, it's a pretty depressing book.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
What really depresses me sometimes, not depresses me, but it makes me sad that, his family died.
Yeah.
And even though he got a new family, God blessed him with a new family and more bigger, it's still kind of sad.
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry.
No. I felt the same way too. It's just kind of like, I mean, the wife, I think, just leaves them. Maybe I'm not remembering that right. But
I think his wife says like, why are you still holding on to?
Yeah, curse your God and die.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But when his children died, I was just like, wow, like, yeah, it's like
that's sad. Yeah.
But those are, like I said, some of the things where you can't really try to comprehensively define, okay, why did God let this happen? And obviously the argument against God's existence in a lot of ways is this idea of, well, explain all this suffering, unnecessary suffering in the world, blah, blah, blah. But like that, I think we get too caught up in that instead of truly having that faith and understanding. Like,
yeah. And I think that's it kind of begs the question of like, what is faith exactly? What does it look like in our day-to-day life? And I think a lot of it does pertain to suffering in the sense that like, when things really turn sour, what does it mean to remain faithful, And I think people don't really think about that in the moment because they're so fixated on all the stuff that's going wrong, right? Instead of thinking like, all right, so what does this mean? What should I do in this moment as a Christian, as a believer? What does it mean for me to remain faithful to God, Yeah,
absolutely.
I think like, I think that, even Jesus says, pick up your cross and follow me. What does that mean? Except that it's going to be bumpy. It's going to be hard, It's not going to be a smooth ride, It's not going to be smooth sailing. It's painful and it's arduous, And Paul repeatedly throughout the New Testament says things like, to really join him in suffering, embrace suffering because it's not needless. There is needless suffering, but the kind of suffering that we're talking about, the ones that God allows, for our good and benefit, those are good for us, and oftentimes they're very necessary in as far as growth goes, And I think that remaining faithful in the midst of suffering and persevering, that's what leads us to spiritual growth. And that's what leads us to truly understanding God's words, the word of God, and truly understanding and realizing God's purpose for us, his path for us, And I think a lot of the times people don't think about that when they pray things like, God, reveal your desire for me. God, tell me what you want. Or like, God, humble me. I'm really scared to pray that prayer. God, humble me. But I don't think people really think about what those prayers mean, But I think inevitably it kind of means that you're in for a ride. Yeah. Because if you really want the good things of God, I think there are not too many instances where, God just is like, all right, here you go, realization,
Yeah.
I don't think necessarily God reveals things through pain all the time, but I think that some of the most rewarding realizations, some of the most rewarding like growth, spiritual growths occur when there is suffering,
Yeah.
So,
and I think there's two different types of suffering in a very simplistic way that I can try to explain. And it's not a very good way, but I think it does kind of get the point across a little bit. And one is, you can take it into consideration of like, there's that needless suffering and there is a suffering that is for a specific purpose. And there are times in needless suffering, and I think those are the times the most where we not only maintain our faithfulness, but that's when we need healing the most. So take, for example, like there's two different types of way people might suffer in terms of physical pain. Like if you're going to the gym and you want to get in better shape and you're really out of shape, and you go and you start to work out 3-4 times a week. After that first week, maybe even after that first day, you are going to be somewhat suffering and physical pain. And you're gonna, and what you do the next day really matters. It's like when you get up and you can barely open your arms because your muscles are so tight and sore from the day before and they're ripped apart and they're trying to regenerate. Are you going to say, okay, this sucks. I don't want to deal with this pain. So therefore, I'm going to walk away from the thing that will eventually get me better. Maybe not better. Obviously working out has a lot of different benefits, but that is going to yield the results for me to get me to a place that I want to be. Or you can say, no, I'm going to deal with this. I understand that there's a purpose for this. And you continue to walk through that suffering until eventually you start to see its fruit and its results. But then in the needless suffering aspect is when you genuinely get hurt physically and you need some sort of medical attention or healing, and I think we sometimes as Christians, we often confuse these two types of suffering in our lives. That one is truly because it will bring about spiritual growth, and we need to know that, okay, not only do I need to remain faithful in God, but he's going to use this to bring me closer to him in the end. And how I choose to respond to that situation is either like like there's a fork in the road. You can say, okay, you know what, God, I'm done. Or you can go, okay, I trust in you, God. I'm going to keep walking through. That's one of the reasons why I think that psalm is such a famous psalm. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for God is with me. So understanding that no matter what the situation is, that if you have that faith in God, if you trust in God, you can get through everything.
Yeah. And I think like, this is another story that really touched me, but like I think the story of Joseph is a very good example of what just being faithful in the midst of suffering looks like, because like I always tell people, it's not like Joseph got sold into slavery because he wanted to get sold into slavery, like he didn't want to be betrayed by his brothers because he wanted, or he didn't get betrayed by his brothers because he wanted that,
Right.
But in the circumstance that he was, allotted, I guess you could say, by God, he just diligently worked with what he had,
He was so pure too. That's the part that is like annoyingly like truthful about him, because like he's so pure to the point that he doesn't understand how arrogant he sounds when he's telling his brothers about the dream,
That's right.
Because I don't think he was telling them to try to be boastful.
He should have,
but like
he was a little insensitive. And I'm sure it has a lot to do with how he was raised, because he was
the favorite son.
Yeah, he was the favorite son, so there was a lot of favoritism, and he was just very naive. But I think, God used his purity or his naivety to just really lead him down this road, because I think if Joseph didn't have the pureness that God gave him, I don't think he would have forgiven his brothers as easily, I think because Joseph was so pure, and because he was so he has that very, I don't want to say naive, but I think he had a big heart. And I think that his diligence, him working with what he had, sort of eventually led him to a wonderful spot. And I think that's just kind of what it means to be faithful, in a sense. It's just trusting in God, not straying away from him, and just working with what God allowed you to work with, in that situation that you're currently in. I think that's faithful. I don't think being faithful is necessarily about like, I have to become an ultra good Christian who does this and that, abides by all the like, I don't know, traditions, or like, things like that. But I think it's simply like, working with what God allowed you in that moment, and trusting in him, clinging to him. And as Jesus put it in, Matthew, like just really clinging to the main branch, main branch. I have really bad memory. I have tried so hard to memorize certain verses, and I'm just like, this is not not gonna happen.
I'm pretty bad with I usually paraphrase the verses that I remember in my head.
I paraphrase heavily.
Which is like somewhat, I think I need to be careful with that sometimes.
Me too. I don't want it to become lost, Like,
right.
There are certain verses that I've memorized that I've forgotten over time. I felt so accomplished too. At the time, I was like, "Yes, I did it," but it's just like, oh, I forget. But I try to go back to it if I do forget.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway,
and you're absolutely right about that. Like Joseph, and one of my favorite lines from that story is at the very end when he's talking about what you meant for evil, God meant for good,
right,
and that was such a powerful line to hear in the aspect of, like, yes, there are times that God might be the one allowing things or ordaining things to happen to maybe bring you towards growth that you don't necessarily quite understand that you need, or maybe don't even want.
Yeah.
But then there are other times where people are just malicious in and of themselves. And there are things in life that happens that, because we have free will, and there's obviously a big discussion on how free will truly affects our faith and all that stuff, but I'm way too dumb to talk about that stuff.
Me too. I'm too dumb for like philosophy and stuff. That's one thing I realized.
I've been getting a lot more into philosophy. I'm hoping to have a philosophy professor on the show soon.
Oh,
I think I
know who you're talking.
But we haven't confirmed a date, so I don't want to say yet. But hopefully, he is able to join, and we can dive a little bit into that. But like philosophy's been a big interest to me lately. But I think the first and foremost thing is I just need to get more faithful.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing, is that oftentimes we try to get to some sort of understanding or comprehension. It's like, okay, if I at least know these things about God, then it'll be a little bit easier for me to believe in him or trust in him or have faith in him. But then I always come back to the story of Israel when they're being led out during the Exodus, and they're seeing all these miracles firsthand, like Moses splitting the sea, manna falling out of the sky and from heaven. They're literally being fed every single day. And what happens when Moses goes to Mount Sinai for 40 days? These dudes literally saw miracles happen.
These dudes,
like, I mean, and women, obviously, but No,
I thought it was funny how you phrased it. Those dudes. Ugh.
It's incredibly frustrating in my head to think about the fact that, like, oh my goodness, you really saw this happen, and then you still decided to be like, oh, actually, we need another God. Like, we need something else to worship.
We need a golden cat.
We need a golden cat. Like, it's incredible. Like, it just baffles me to this day. So
it does. I remember I used to hate the Israelites with a burning passion because they're always so quick to turn away from God despite everything that they physically witness. And even like, one of the most mind-boggling things is like when they were like, oh, we were better off in Egypt. It's like, you were slaves. Like, you were mistreated. Like, what is going on, But I think at some point I realized that the Israelites are just like, a very good reflection of who we are.
Oh, absolutely.
And how quick we are to just so quick to turn around and be like, you know what? Forget God, I'm going to worship this idol, I'm going to devote myself to this or that. And even people like David, even people like Solomon, they had downfalls, very big downfalls, and I think that, I realized that, like, where was I going with this? I don't know. But I think I realized that, like, truly human nature is just so unreliable. Like, there were so many times in my life where I was like, oh God, I'm never gonna turn away from you ever again, but it just doesn't happen that way, I think we're just on this journey of continuous, like, fall and then getting back up, and I guess just sanctification.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it's
a lifelong process. And like you were saying earlier, we're not striving for perfection. And the point of being a Christian isn't to be this all holy, righteous person that knows everything about the Bible or anything like that. Like, yes, like there are things to aim for. That's the whole point of us wanting to become more like Christ, that we are, every single day we're understanding that today is a day for me to try to be a little bit more like Christ. And if you actually succeed, then by the time, if God's graced us enough with many, many years on earth, then we will become that much closer to becoming like Christ. We'll never be perfect, but we can get a lot closer than some people will who give up on a daily basis instead of understanding what that gift is. And I think it really starts on that daily basis, and something that I really struggle with too, because I take so many days for granted, that waste so many days of my life. And, by the end of it, I'm like, wow, if today was the last day for me to live, what a waste.
Yeah.
And then I have this grand reflection. I'm like, oh, okay, so every day I'm going to not make it like, not like YOLO type mentality, but just understanding I'm going to be as grateful for today as I can possibly be. Then I wake up the next morning. It's like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's how quick we are to fall, just like you said with the Israelites. And they really reflect our daily lives so much, because, when we read that, we're like, oh, that is so annoying. But then you know what the craziest thing is, and this is something that really humbled me in a lot of ways, and this isn't really a biblical thing, but I think it's very true, is that the thing you hate the most about other people is usually the thing you criticize the most about yourself. And
yeah.
the stuff that I see like in the Bible a lot about, I was like, they are pissing me off.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, oh yeah, I'm actually just like them. And,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
it's just,
I definitely think, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I am an Israelite. Not like, you know.
nah,
You know what I mean? Yeah,
yeah.
not nationally, but yeah, like I am very quick to turn back to my old ways, and every time I do, it reminds me of, you know, a lot of, you know, it reminds me of like you know, like First Corinthians, where Paul talks about like, you know, on the judgment day, you know, every Christian is going to have to stand before God, and he's going to evaluate your work, you know, the quality of your work.
Yeah.
And so it always reminds me, whenever I'm kind of like, you know, not up to par with where I should be in, like spiritually, it reminds me of how sad it would be if on that day, you know, it's revealed that I just squandered like so much of my life doing meaningless and stupid things, you know, things that
Right.
don't matter before God, instead of using my time and energy and resources to really build up God's kingdom and really build up something that will last, you
Yeah.
know?
Absolutely.
And that's not to say like, you know, people shouldn't rest. I think people should rest, you know, but there's a difference between resting productively, like productive rest, and being lazy, like squandering your time and energy, or squandering your time, and yeah. And you know, like I catch myself a lot of the times doing like squandering my life, you know, doing things and committing to things that really don't matter ultimately.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I just like, yeah, I used to really dislike the Israelites, but but now I'm like, you know, I kind of feel that I'm like, yeah, I get why they did that. It's ridiculous, but like, you know, I'm the same in the end. You know, I'm a liar, I'm a cheater, a murderer, an adulterer, idolater. You know, I'm all of those things and more. And that also reminds me, you know, that like Paul, you know, even after his conversion, he always says things like, I'm the worst sinner, you know, I'm the worst of the worst, you know, sinner amongst sinners. And for a while, you know, my thought on that was like, how can you say that? You know, like, I don't understand. Like, he was such a godly man. And his only pursuit in life after his conversion was like, you know, like, I mean, he was just very zealous for God, you know. But I think I realized where that attitude comes from. You know, I think that is a true humble attitude for a Christian to have, is to consider yourself, you know, a sinner amongst sinners. You know?
Absolutely.
And I realized subsequently that I am very arrogant. I'm like, I used to be like, you know, oh, I'm not that bad. At least I didn't do that. You know, at least I'm not like one of those guys over there. You know?
Right.
But actually that means I'm arrogant. And in reality, you know, it's how Jesus says, like, you know, if you hate your brother, you've committed murder. You know, you murdered him, you know. And so he didn't quite put it that way. But again, I have a hard time with verbatim.
Right. And Jesus liked to put a lot of stuff into the extremes. And I think a very important part of that is to kind of help us to truly understand like where our values really truly lie. And it goes back to what you were talking about with First Corinthians, of how our works are evaluated. And you can take this to the story of Abraham when God asked him to sacrifice his son, to the story of Job, him truly understanding, what do you value the most in your life? Is it God, or is it the stuff that you've been given? And yeah, like, it's just, when we truly can't put God at the center of it all, if we're not willing to risk everything, if we're not willing to throw it all away, like, because what does it really mean to pick up your cross and follow him daily? You know what I mean? And like, and I think it can definitely get confusing because some people might take that to the actual extreme and be like, okay, well, in order for me to love God and Christ, that means that I need to pretty much verbatim listen to what he's talking about, and so I got to throw everything away. Like, some people are like saying that you can't even have wealth if you want to be a good Christian, and like it starts getting distorted, you know.
But you know, sorry,
go ahead.
I would actually argue that, and this is one of my frustrations, is like I would argue that most people, they don't take Jesus seriously enough. It's like, you know, it's kind of like what you were saying before. A lot of people are like, oh, I need to, like, you know, commit to Jesus, have faith in Jesus, and, you know, I need to do this and that. The Bible tells me to do this and that, but at the end of the day, it's like, what does that even mean?
Yeah,
because a lot of people are out there living their lives to the full extent, as far as, like, you know, materialism, financial, you know, those aspects. As far as those aspects of life go, they're living their life to the fullest, and kind of deceiving themselves into thinking, oh, as long as I read the Bible, as long as I go out to church, as long as I teach my kids these things, you know, I'm a good and faithful Christian. It's like, you know, it's so frustrating for me a lot of the times. Although, you know, I know it's not always my place to be frustrated, but sometimes it's frustrating because it's like, what are you devoting your money to? You know, is it biblical? You know, is you and your family buying all those materials, you know, that luxury good, that $1,000 handbag, is that biblical? You know,
right. Yeah.
But the Bible tells us to, you know, give to the needy as needed. You know, share our material, our possessions. You know, all that we have.
Yeah.
And it's the same with just about anything else, like career. What does it mean to devote your career to God? Like, sometimes I want to ask people, like, what does it mean? You know?
Yeah.
It's like, oh God, I'm trying to become a doctor and I'm going to devote that to you. It's like, what led you down this path? You know, why do you feel convicted that this is what God wants for you?
Right.
Or if your career is just kind of secondary, what is the goal of your life? You know? Relationships, you know, like, what does it mean to devote a relationship to God, or to commit, you know, be faithful in your relationship and stuff like that, you know, as a Christian? Sometimes I wonder if people actually think about these things according to the Bible, and not just like, you know, oh, this is what appears good as a Christian.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And it's amazing that you mentioned that. That's one of the things I brought up to not only my brother, but to Pastor Steve as well when I was speaking to them during my discussions with them. And, you know, the first thing that I wanted to like bring up, and I'm just kind of regurgitating stuff that I've learned from them, but I think it's really valuable the way that they described it. And there's this thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Like you said, you took psychology, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know if you're familiar with that. Are you?
I don't think so.
Okay, so
probably not.
there's this thing called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and like legitimately, I'm just regurgitating what my brother said, but it's this on this XY axis, and it's what you learn when you're learning something new, like a new skill or anything. So, like for me, like I can take myself as an example for let's say like I started learning chess, and then when you start learning, you kind of go up, and as you start to learn, you get to a point where you're like, okay, like now I know something.
Yeah.
And you think that you know everything about it, and you're like feeling really, really good about yourself. Like,
yeah.
And a lot of people notice this at work a lot of the times when they get into a new skill trade or a new department, and then they learn a few things and they're like, oh yeah, I figured it out. But mainly they're just going off of their operating procedure worksheet, and then something actually really that needs to get them thinking happens, and I have no idea what they're doing, right? And when they get to that point, that's called a peak of stupidity.
No.
Right?
I love that.
Yeah, because you realize like, oh, like I don't know anything. And then you fall into this valley. Yeah. And they call that the valley of despair. Because you're just like, oh my gosh, I thought I knew everything, but I really don't know anything. This is terrible. And then as you continue to grow, and it's a much more steady and slow incline, that's when you kind of reach this enlightenment.
Sure.
Right. And the way he explained that was so meaningful, because this is, I think, the entire process of someone being reborn in Christ in a lot of ways. Because, you kind of come to this understanding of what faith is and what Jesus did, and you're like, oh my God, like, this is amazing. And then you start to read the Bible, you go to church, or you start to be more committed. And then you're like, okay, cool. Like, I'm a really good Christian now. And that's the peak of stupidity. Because not only do you not realize what you're actually saying, because you're not a good Christian, like, because none of us are truly good Christian. That's like right. We are all fall short of the glory of God. That is the biggest thing that we sometimes forget. We know, but we forget this when we go about our daily lives. Like, we do some good stuff, and you're like, yeah, God's going to see that. It's like, and then it becomes transactionary. But then I think the process of sanctification is when you start to truly fall into that valley of despair. But the valley of despair is not necessarily from the sanctification process. It's not actually a valley of despair. I think it's like coexists with the enlightenment in general, because that despair doesn't truly ever go away as a Christian to a certain degree, because the closer I draw to God, the more I realize how terrible of a sinner I actually am. And that goes back to Paul's point of when he says, I am the least of the apostles. Where his humility truly comes from, because he understands that no matter how much he tries, there's always something he's falling short of. And he recognizes that, but he's not ashamed of it. He's willing to work on it. That's why he's working on it. Because he's like, I understand that I have so much to work on, and I'm going to work on every single one of them as much as I possibly humanly can. But I know that I am still going to fail, because there's nothing I can possibly do in my lifetime to become perfect like God wants me to be perfect, because that's why he had to send Jesus. That's why he had to make that sacrifice for us.
Yeah, and I think that's so surprising. Is that the more you know God, and the more you know about your failures and your shortcomings and your vices, the more you're willing to expose yourself. And I think that's so surprising, because it's human nature to try to cover that up. And to only sort of project the good sides of you, of yourself, like the seemingly perfect sides of yourself. And I think that's so surprising. I know I keep saying that, but it truly is. Like, the more I think about it, it's like, a couple years ago, I was kind of ashamed to tell people that at first I didn't get into college, or like, that I had such a childhood and stuff, and even like all the sexual harassment and stuff that I went through. It was really hard to be forthcoming about that, because it's from, I don't know about other girls and stuff like that, but from my point of view, it's embarrassing. It's not something to go and talk about. Like, it's not something to brag about. It's not something that makes me a better person. It's like, it's none of those things. So why would I go and tell people about it? But I think after I came to know Christ better, and after I really, really just came to a deeper understanding of who Jesus is to me, who God is to me, I think I realized that like I am nothing. My story is so insignificant, you know? I know that that's not like, you know, true. I would never tell someone if they ever shared their testimony like your story is insignificant, you know?
Yeah.
So in a sense that's not how I mean it, but in the big picture, in the grand scheme of things, right? I am a nobody, you know. I do not even compare to Jesus Christ,
Yeah.
you know. But and so like it's not my story that really matters, but it's that, you know, by telling people how the role that Christ played in drawing me near to him,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, you know, it's kind of spotlighting Jesus, you know.
Yeah.
And I think that like the goal is to show people that, hey, there's someone there out there, you know, that you don't know yet, but like, you know, he means something, you know. I don't know how to explain it, but it's just like, you know, I think that the more people come to know God, the more attached to perfect, like, you know, showing this perfect image of themselves, you know, and they kind of forget, they kind of just lose that, and they just focus on like, okay, so, you know, I'm not perfect, but by the grace of God, you know, I'm being made perfect, and I will be perfect one day. And I think that's so surprising and so beautiful. I don't know where I was going with that.
No, like I love that, because I think it's really lost in a lot of the true sense of what is being taught in a lot of different churches.
That's true. Yeah.
And you know, reputation is plays such a big factor in how we not only identify as members of society, but even in the church itself, especially within Korean churches.
Oh yeah.
And I can't speak for other Asian churches, but I would imagine that if there are certain hierarchical, familial roles in those types, like whatever types of cultures have those types of roles, where it's really important to have this sense of responsibility and maintaining this image to represent your family or anything like that. They kind of almost, and you know, maybe I'm going a little too far into parts that I don't know what I'm talking about, but I think they do take a little bit too much of that and form this knot with Christianity, and they tie it together and go, okay, I'm supposed to represent God.
Yeah.
So if I don't show God, show other people who I am, and I'm not in good standing with other people, then I'm not in good standing with God.
Yeah.
And they have more of a focus on their image. They have a bigger focus on their reputation than just trying to please God and glorify Him.
That's right.
And all that we do. And I did like how Pastor Steve broke this down, because I was asking about, well, how do you glorify God, you know, when you're at work, or how do you glorify God when you're cooking, you know? And he said something that he heard from these two missionaries, which that there are only two occupations that you can't be involved in as a believer, and those are prostitution and racketeering. And and like he was saying that what they were actually trying to underscore the principle was that, like, you can glorify God in anything that you do as long as they're not criminal activities, and that they're not against the actual laws of God. So, you know, you can be, and kind of what you were talking about earlier, I think the intent and the motivation should be clear. And like, okay, well, if you're becoming a doctor, like, how do you know that that's God's calling for you? And I think the intention matters, because, okay, well, this is a talent that God gave to me.
Yeah.
So how am I going to use my talent to glorify God? And yes, obviously, it can't just be some sort of representation of your lifestyle. It has to go a little bit deeper than that. You know, what are you doing within the medical field if you become a doctor to at least somewhat like get God's message out? Not necessarily, I think, in, you know, you're trying to be a minister within a medical community or something like that, but it's more so like, is all of your actions and the motivations of how you practice that medicine, do you truly have God in your heart, in your mind when you're doing that? You know, that that there are no, like, and it drives your ethical decisions, it drives your medical decisions, you know. And there are people that go so far as to pretty much like what brands they buy from. You know, they'll actually research that.
Oh wow!
And be like, okay, like how much of this does this align with, you know, God? And they won't buy and support certain like brands because of what they represent and stuff like that. And, you know, obviously, I don't think there's anything wrong with them doing that, but it's not sustainable to every facet of our lives in some situations, in my opinion. Or maybe I'm just too lazy to research it.
No,
it's probably
I don't think it's possible to be 100%, like for instance, like 100% waste free,
right? Yeah.
Or 100% like supportive of ethical, I don't know, production of clothes, or, you know, I think it's a very wonderful ideal, and I think that one person contributing to that ideal does make a difference. But I do think that some people are a little bit too passionate about, like, for instance, like veganism, like, you know,
right? Yeah.
You know, not eating meat and stuff. But yeah, I do agree with the former thought that, like, you know, I think people just in general should be more intentional about what it means to be faithful on a very practical level. So, you know, a lot of people say, like, oh, God, give me faith, or like, oh, I just want to increase my faith and stuff. But, like, how? You know, like, what have you thought about what that means on a practical level? You know,
right.
And like at your current life stage, you know, life situation and stuff. And like, I don't know, I
think people really they really don't actually know what they're asking for when they say that stuff. And it kind of goes to your point about earlier when you said you're really scared to pray about stuff like, God, humble me.
Oh yeah.
Because along with that prayer comes, and I ask for that all the time, but and sometimes, like, I think I should be a little scared of what I'm asking for, just because humbling me might come at something that I really don't want to do in my life.
Yeah.
You know, and it reminds me of the story of that this dude who those dudes.
Yeah,
those dudes. But, you know, he comes up to Jesus and he's telling him, "Hey, I've followed all of God's laws."
Like the young rich man.
Yeah, the young rich man.
That guy.
And he's pretty much saying, "I've followed all of your rules, like all of the rules that are supposed to make me a good person."
That is a good example.
And what else do I need to do? And Jesus essentially says, well, you need to sell all your possessions and, like, leave everything and come follow me. And he's unable to do that. And I think the key takeaway from that passage is not that Jesus was saying, don't be rich.
Yeah.
It's that this rich man who had so much wealth and was trying to draw closer to God, he had an interest in it.
Yeah.
He wanted to. So he's following all these rules and regulations and laws, but his heart is not 100% there, and something is holding him back from it. And he's asking Jesus, what is holding me back from truly committing 100% of myself to you? And Jesus is going, well, your wealth.
Yeah.
So if you really want to commit,
Mm-hmm.
then you have to throw that away.
Yeah.
And some people, what God is asking us to give up,
Yeah.
we're not willing to give it up.
Exactly. And it's like, I'm not saying like to your earlier point, it's not like we're trying to say like, oh, don't become a doctor, or like, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that. That's not the point. I think the point is that like, I think people just have this general understanding of the concept of faith, and they just don't know how it applies to their life. So for example, right, I think at one point in my life I was like kind of addicted to gaming.
Same.
Confession time. But games are addicting. They're fun and they're super graphic. They're designed to sort of hook you in, And if all your other friends play it, it's like game over. You're, no pun intended. It's like it's like you're in for a rabbit hole of just like, devoting hours of your life to gaming.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I can relate, truly. Yeah. I had one vice really for PlayStation. It was 2K.
Oh no.
And it got bad.
For me, I used to have an Xbox, and I think Overwatch and like Apex was so fun. But I recognize that as a Christian, as a believer, this is not good for me. This is not a good way to utilize the time that God is giving me, and it's actually taking away from the time that I spend from God.
Yeah.
For obvious reasons. If I'm gaming, I can't read the Bible at the same, things like that. But anyway, I had a really hard time making a faithful decision, and I would pray to God like, God, please help me not to play games. For example, please help me to spend more time with you. But it's like, I think a lot of people expect some kind of miracle, like change of heart and mind. But a lot of times that's not really how God works. It's not like God suddenly like is like, Sophia, I'm going to fix everything. And one day, you're just like, oh God, I'm gonna stop gaming. It doesn't happen that way. It's like you have to implement you have to make faithful decisions. Like God gives you conviction, and it's kind of your duty to make a decision based on that conviction. So for me, like, it was really hard, but that's why it's rewarding, and that's why it's faith. It was really hard, but I actually just got rid of my Xbox. I just deleted my account, and I just got rid of my Xbox. And because I was so convicted one day while I was praying, I prayed for a while, like, God, please help me to stop gaming. I felt so convicted one day by what Jesus said in Matthew. It's that, like, if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it into the fire. If your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it into the fire. And I felt so convicted by that. That was like, you know what? Yeah, he's right. If I really want to stop gaming, I have to get rid of the source of my sin. And so that's what I did. And I consider that an act of faith, right?
Yeah.
And I think that those kinds of practical measures that people take, I think that's part of what faith is, and it shouldn't just stop at the conceptual level of understanding.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for instance, like, I have a lot of friends my age, and a common theme, a common struggle is, sexual sin, as a Christian. And they're like, I know I shouldn't, do this or that, but I don't know. I can't, I can't control myself. And it's just like, well, what are you doing practically? How are you practically exercising your faith?
Right.
And they like don't know how to answer. They don't know what that means to them. And so I'll be like, well, for example, if you struggle with your girlfriend or boyfriend, right? Not to be in, the same room alone, et cetera, or, not to, hold hands with them, which sounds silly, but it's like, it's true. Like whatever it takes, to not sin, I'm like, no, I never thought of it like that. And it's just kind of like, I think people need to start engaging in more of that practical aspect of faith.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think, to your point too, I've had similar situations where I've had to kind of cut it at the source because I knew that putting myself in that surrounding would just make it so easy for me to fall. But then there are other parts where I think it really depends on what your need from God's purpose and will is. There are certain things I think if you truly are acting out of faith that he can give you those immediate just changes.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah.
One example I guess I would have is like for me it's really hard to explain how this actually happened in my life because and don't get me wrong, I still fail from time to time, but I used to curse so much.
Yeah.
Like so much. Every other word. As much as I say, it was the F word,
oh no,
something word in there.
Yeah.
And like, man, and sometimes I think about that and I'm like, man, it's like this woman married me. Like she has to hear this every single day. And I'm at work, talking to every sort of age person. Like it doesn't really matter. And to me, like my justification is like, I'm not cursing anybody out.
Yeah.
I mean, granted, sometimes I would definitely be saying things in that type of manner, but it's just like I was making all these excuses, right? And eventually, as I'm starting to come to a better understanding of my faith, and God is really convicting me in a lot of ways, and I'm praying for him to grant me wisdom in a lot of different aspects of my life and the way that like truly that he wants me to receive. And that's one of the prayers that I always like to pray, especially before I read the Bible, is that I just ask that he will grant me the wisdom to truly receive his word the way that he wants me to receive it.
Yeah.
That the way that is truly meant to be received. That like I don't want to be falsely I don't want to be led astray by false teachings. I don't want to be led astray by these what's the word I'm looking for? Like these very flowered up and packaged ways that people try to explain the Bible away in a lot of different passages.
Yeah.
And just one day I wake up and like I said, I can't really explain this, but just legitimately I just hated the fact that I was cussing. I just hated it.
Yeah.
And although the process in itself took some time, but every time I started to cuss, before there was no feeling, there was like no emotion behind it. Whatever.
Yeah.
But every time I cuss, I'm like, it stung.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, oh, why did I just do that?
Yeah.
So I'm failing over and over and over again. But every single time I'm doing it, that conviction is hitting me even harder. And I think God definitely like gives you those like definitive changes in your heart, because those are kind of just to me unexplainable, that something that I took so lightly, all of a sudden, like just the thought of it is
like
I know.
Yeah. I'm definitely, I mean, I'm not saying it always follows the same. It's not like a formula,
Right.
where,
Yeah.
in order to change, you have to, take some kind of practical action, and like exercise your faith physically, like practically. But I think it's true that, man, I don't know if this is accurate to say, but I almost want to say that, like, true transformation is always kind of triggered by like conviction,
Yeah. No,
so
that's true.
God gives you the conviction, just like how you felt like, I hate this. I feel like that would be a conviction that God gives you.
Yeah, conviction.
Yeah.
But I think the difference is, like, for instance, on the thing that I had to cut out of my life,
Yeah.
was I used to, be heavily into smoking weed, and I smoked for a very long time. And this conviction hit me, but at the same time, it was a conviction that, unlike cursing, where like I mess up, then yeah, it hurts, but then I can continue to just work on it on a daily aspect, and that aspect of it was a lot easier for me to come to grips with. That I can go and be with a bunch of people who are cussing around me and not feel some need to curse around them. I don't need to feel like I need to be relatable in this conversation by having to cuss. I can now be the person that doesn't cuss, and people might be wondering, like, but with weed, is that I had that conviction, so I'm like throwing everything away. I'm done. It's like, and because to me, I had all these like legal reasons, oh, it's just a plant, it's finally legal now. Like, it's medicinal. There's so much medical uses for it, and coming up with all of these excuses and logical, quote unquote, reasons as to why this isn't really against scripture, and there's nowhere that God says you can't smoke, like blah 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 blah. And to a certain point, like I still think that, like, maybe there isn't, but God gave me some sort of conviction in my heart that truly I believe, because number one, was smoking getting me anywhere closer to God? Is the first question I really ask.
Right.
And maybe to some people, maybe it does. I can't really answer that question for them. But for me, the answer was no. The things that I wanted to do to get closer to God was by, like you said, becoming more diligent in my actual, like, practical lifestyle. Like, what am I doing to actually glorify God or get closer to Him? Am I reading the Bible more faithfully? Am I praying on a more consistent basis? And even today, it's on a pathetically low level, but like, it's getting better, But I don't think that by making the excuse to continue to just get high, because, like, for me, another reason was, like, I struggle with a lot of anxiety, and like, I wouldn't say that, like, I was visibly and actively depressed, but then again, I would make the excuse of, being high was the reason I'm not depressed.
I see.
Like, being high is the reason I can function. Being high is the reason I can get up in the morning and go to this job that I don't like. And it was almost my idol.
Yeah.
It was the thing that I relied on more than God to help me through these situations in life, when truly I need to be focusing on the fact that if I have my focus on God, He will keep me from having to go down these dark paths, or that if I do go down these dark paths, that He'll lead me out of it.
Yeah.
And once I realized that, I was like, okay, I need to get rid of this. But I also know myself, because even after throwing it away, one day I find, like, a random pen.
Yeah.
Like,
oh no.
So fail
What's
again.
that doing there?
So it's just so I had to pretty much cut everybody out of my life that smokes. And like they're not bad people.
Yeah.
They're good friends of mine. They've been friends of mine for a long, long time, and I grew up with them in a lot of different ways. But and I don't think anything badly of them. But
no, yeah, that's not our job.
yeah, it's just. But I had to, because I knew that I couldn't be in that environment without feeling that influence, not from them, not from some sort of peer pressure, just from my own fallenness, that I go over there and I'm going to be like, hey, can I, you know, so I had to cut it like at the root.
Yeah.
And
that's awesome. Yeah. I mean, that's really hard to do, you know?
Yeah. But slowly I'm starting to become better at being able to be around people who are smoking, or not like smoking directly, but you know, just who still adhere to those types of not be pressured by it.
Yeah, no, I think I'm getting your point. And you know, I'm not saying that in all instances where temptation is present we must cut off the, you know, the potential source of the sin or temptation. I'm just saying that, you know, that's just one way to practically implement or practically exercise your faith, you know? And I think that you're absolutely right. There are times when God calls us to be present amongst sinners and people who just do not know Christ, you know, and that's exactly what Jesus did. For like, that was a big part of his ministry, was he went out and he spent time with sinners, you know, and he he did not judge them, he didn't condemn them, but he simply was present. He ate with them, he spent time with them, he talked to them, you know. And I think that Christians, in the same way, we are called to be the salt and light of the world. You know, we're called to be present amongst, you know, people who live in darkness,
right? So
that, you know, they might draw near to Christ. But at the same time, it's just this fine line of like, and I think this is something from Pastor Steve's sermon, actually. It's like, I think a lot of the times people have this mentality of like, I can help this person, I can pull them back up. But it's easier to fall with a person than to actually lift the person back up, you know?
And he actually said that during our interview.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I think that's so true. It's just, we just have to be very aware and careful as Christians of like, okay, am I truly influencing this person with Christ's light? Or is this person influencing me?
Right.
And I think if there's even an ounce of this feeling that I'm being influenced, or if there's desire creeping back into my life, you just have to know how to end things or how to distance yourself from it.
Yeah.
You know, you don't necessarily have to cut yourself off, but there has to be this element of like distancing, knowing how to practically distance yourself from sin.
No, absolutely.
Yeah. And I remember watching an interview with Paul Washer speaking, and he was saying, you know, like, and this isn't verbatim, but the general point he was trying to make was like, you know, if you know, you're standing in front, if you run across like a very venomous snake, you know, and he's getting ready to strike at you, you would just stare at it and stand there. You know, you would try to avoid it. You would, you know, best case scenario, you would cut off the head, you know, so that it dies, you know, there's no chance of it striking you now. And I think it's the same sort of message in the Bible, where it says, you know, sin is kind of just waiting for you, you know, to even have a little bit of room for failure, for you to stumble. And I think that you just have to recognize that and know how to shut it down.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's more along the lines of like what I was trying to say. I don't think, you know, this practical aspect, it doesn't follow like the same pattern and such, but knowing how to apply the word.
No, absolutely.
And things like that. But yeah, I mean, thanks for like opening up about like, you know, your weed. I don't know how else to say it. But you know, like I understand, and it's like I think Christians, especially like Asian Christians, they have such a they tend to stigmatize people for certain sins that they struggle with, so like smoking and like you know drugs and stuff, when in reality it's all the same. You know, we're all sinners, like you said. We all fall short of the glory of God, and God regards all sin, you know, just as disgusting, you know, abhorrible. So
yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and you'd be surprised that of how many people that just actively go to church are doing all of this stuff.
Oh yeah,
and it's
I'm sure.
yeah, like because you know, and actually, I won't get into all of that stuff, but like you know, there's. That's one of the reasons why, for me, it was so hard for me to come back to church for the longest time, is that there was definitely a big aspect of me not truly like committing myself to Christ. But at the same time, there was never a point in my life where I said, God, you're not real, or I don't want anything to do with you. For a very large portion of my life, I had this conviction of, well, kind of too late for me now. I've gone too far down the other path, and I know that I'm just going to go to hell. And so it wasn't about, oh, I lost faith in God. It's just I lost faith not only in the fact of truly, well, no, I did lose faith in God because I didn't understand what his message was. But like I also didn't actually trust myself that I could even do anything about it. Like to me, it was just such a big conviction of like, oh yeah, you're just a piece of crap. And like, but like for some reason, I was able to hold this really pathetic mentality with my head held high. Like, yeah, I am this piece of crap. Like, but
That's
in the
so
worldly
funny.
sense, you know, now I'm kind of like, yeah, I am a worthless sinner, but I can still hold my head up high because I know that I am truly righteous by the grace of God. And that's a different type of understanding of what it means to not try to put yourself up on some sort of pedestal. But I think the point that I really wanted to make by saying that is that, yes, there are a lot of conversations that we don't bring up within the church circles because, not only are they embarrassing, but there's a lot of judgment that follows.
Yeah.
There's a lot of just unnecessary drama that follows. I mean, even going back to your story earlier about like when you truly felt convicted to talk about your to the EM pastor and how it blew up. Like nobody wants to deal with all that stuff. Like nobody truly wants more conflict that's bred from conflict. They just want some sort of peace. And I think there are times we confuse just peace with not actually talking about things that will bring you peace, but suffering in silence and not bringing the conversations to the table.
That's another one of my frustrations. And I'm trying not to exclude myself because I fall into the same category. So, you know, this is also a frustration I have against myself. But, you know, one frustration I have against, you know, the church in general is that nowadays people are too nice. You know, they're not willing to confront people. And in a way, it's kind of unbiblical because, you know, Paul charges us to rebuke and, you know, preach and stuff like that. So, you know, rebuking can be biblically done. But I think people forget that it is biblical to rebuke people in some cases and properly, you know, gently and, you know, not with hatred, but with love, you know, with a spirit of love and in Christ. I don't think people know how to rebuke other people in the church, especially around things that are kind of iffy. So, this also kind of ties into your story, but like, I don't think compromising your faith, I don't think that's rebuked enough in church. So, for instance, like wealth, right? If someone's very wealthy and they're obviously not spending in a very biblical manner, right? Nobody rebukes that, If somebody is, gossiping, nobody rebukes that. In fact, people would more likely join within the gossip, participate in the gossiping than to stop it from happening, and telling them, hey, that's not biblical, that's not what God wants, and that's divisive, things like that. It's so frustrating to see because it's like, well, what the Bible says, so why aren't we putting it into action? Like, why aren't we putting it into practice, and why are we allowing these things to happen? And, I think, just compromising your spiritual life, I think that's such a dangerous path to walk, because I think compromise is often synonymous to like lukewarm faith, like you're not quite there, but you're not quite doing that either. You're not quite sinning, quote unquote, but you're not quite like, what I'm saying? Yeah. So it's just it's so dangerous, because at the end of the day, having a lukewarm faith and making lukewarm decisions and lukewarm commitment, it's not good when in the eyes of God,
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I don't know. That's just one thought that I have.
No, I completely agree with you. We definitely allow these compromises to happen so much in our walk with Christ, and especially within a lot of different Christian communities. But I think the big reason that happens in the first place is because, to your point, we're not intentional with the way we approach our relationship with God, that we approach our relationship with fellow brothers and sisters within the community, that we'd rather gossip than talk about and be vulnerable about our faith with each other, because we're supposed to be the body of Christ, but the body of Christ doesn't know how the body is functioning. So we don't even know how we're actually functioning in our lives. So then if you don't actually know somebody on a personal level, then they're not going to be able to rebuke them. They're not going to be able to righteously judge them, because you haven't taken the time. We haven't taken the time to really get to know each other on a level that we can, in a productive and loving and compassionate way, say, you're wrong. Like, stop and fix this. Like, your family member who knows you on a very deep level coming up to you and saying, you have a problem. You're going to take that much differently than some random person who might see your obvious problem and come out and call you out. But you're going to take that very, very differently. It's like, who are you? And so I think within the community of like church, we need to actually become a true body of Christ. And while we are the body of Christ through Christ himself, who's the head, but like, what are we doing to strengthen that body? You're absolutely right. Like, I think, efforts have to be made in that, like, conversations need to be more intentional, instead of talking about like, oh, my week was like this, or, I did this for work. Like, share something more meaningful as a body of Christ, and at the same time, I think that, it even goes beyond just putting in an effort to make the relationship more meaningful, so that you have a basis for, constructive criticism and stuff like that. I think it also is like, we have to rely on God for wisdom. How do we go about confronting people on things that, saying things that need to be said and stuff? Because at the end of the day, it is God
who moves people's hearts. It's God who changes people's hearts. So if we're saying things out of, even if well-meaning, well-intended, I think people saying certain things can have unfavorable consequences, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So I think really knowing how to rely on God, you know, to really move someone's heart, knowing how to place from a place of, you know, gentleness, of love. I think that's really important. I think a lot of people think that they're coming from a place of love, but in reality, they're probably coming from a place of pride.
Right.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying this because I know I'm right and you're wrong.
Yeah.
Someone has to tell this guy, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I think just really thinking, you know, 2 times, you know, 3 times before you say something. That's really important too.
Yeah.
You know, the Bible says a lot about people's words and people's tongue.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the tongue is like a wildfire, you know.
Yeah.
And,
the only thing that can't be tamed.
Yeah. And you know, I think being slow to speak is a good practice in general.
Yeah.
You know, thinking about what you're saying, praying to God about what you will say, and whether you should say it, things like that, you know.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It's a tough. I mean, it's just a tough practice in general.
Mm-hmm.
Like knowing how to rebuke people, how to confront people, because you know, I feel like modern day churches, there really is a lot to say, but a lot of people tend to sugarcoat things, or you know, only pick and choose things in the Bible to say because they sound nice, and they won't. They probably this probably won't offend that person. You know, there's so much emphasis now on not offending someone.
Yeah.
And I think that's so unfortunate and so sad.
Yeah.
Unbiblical even, yeah.
I mean, even from our childhood, the Bible was portrayed in such a way of just making it like kid friendly, and like the Bible is some sort of PG rated, you know, thing that is universally accessible to all ages in a very contemporary way. But in reality, like there's some really, really dark messages that come out of the Bible that like you sometimes you're reading them and you're like, what the heck is going on right now?
Yeah.
Like, and people don't want to address those. They don't want to grapple and wrestle with their own minds of, okay, like in these situations, I can't quite logically define or understand what is going on. But in that moment, like I said, like these are where the arguments become the most prevalent between, you know, the atheists, the agnostics, or any of the arguments against why believing in God and the Bible or its inerrancy or blah blah blah, it gets like weak because well, how do you explain when God does this? And but then the difficult part of it is that so many Christians get completely stumped because they're not willing to actually go through those passages. They're not actually seeking God's wisdom in those like moments that we've truly kind of lost in a lot of ways what the meaning of those scriptures are. Yeah. Because I don't think they were unclear throughout the entire history of time. I think it becomes more and more unclear throughout generations the longer you avoid trying to answer the questions, and that you avoid trying to like make sense of, okay, this is something that I might practically in my life not really agree with, but am I going to put myself in the place of God? You know, what are you ultimately doing there?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, no, that's very true. I think that you know, personally, anytime it talks about like the role of women, it's like whenever Paul, you know, talks about, you know, wives submit to your husbands, or like wives don't do this, don't do that, etc., etc. Like, I think growing up, I had a really hard time with those.
That's crazy you mentioned that, because I was like debating and grappling in my own head. I was like, should I ask her about this passage?
Yeah, no, it's hard to reconcile that with the human like sort of notion and like intuition of like freedom, you know. But I think that what matters, right? Because I'm also sure, like, this is another thing with like, I don't want to compromise. Like, I don't want to be like, oh, you know, Paul was probably speaking from his time. I think it does have a little to do with that. Like, I think Paul was speaking, I'm sure some of it had to do with his cultural sort of understanding of social roles, right? But another thing is like, I think that what matters here is the spirit of the word. And I, you know, like, there was you know that movie Passion of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
The actor, I forgot his name, Jim Caviezel, I think. Yeah, he's Christian, and I remember in one interview that he had, this was so impressionable to me, but he said freedom is not having the right to do whatever you want to. It's having the right to do what you ought to do. And that was so impressionable for me. And, you know, I think it's the same message that's being sent when Paul says, wives, submit to your husbands. Women shouldn't adorn themselves with jewelry or extravagance and stuff like that. I think, you know, what he's trying to say here is, you know, you should do what you ought to do, given, you know, who God made you to be, man, woman. He even applies the same sort of, I don't know how to explain it. Like, for instance, like slaves, he says, like, slaves, submit to your masters, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it's just like, you know, I think, yes, I do agree that, like, I used to more be on the compromising side, like, oh, you know, like he probably only meant that because that was just the cultural norm at the time. But more and more, I actually agree with Paul. For instance, like, you know, this is a very unpopular and like what's the word? Like, controversial opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree that, like, you know, women should dress a certain way or shouldn't dress a certain way, more specifically, because, you know, what kind of message are you trying to send by dressing the way you do, right? And this is something I'm constantly convicted of because as a girl, you know, I am very materialistic. Like, I love jewelry. I love, you know, certain types of clothing. I love looking like presentable and like fashionable. But even, I think this even applies to women who like to bare their skin and stuff, you know, because like the fashion that's catered towards women these days, it's kind of on the more revealing side. And sometimes I question that as a Christian because it's like, you know, I think, yes, I understand this notion of like, women should be, people in general, not even just women, they should be able to wear what they want to wear. You know, they should have the freedom to express themselves. And I do agree to that to an extent because, you know, I think people are individualist. God made people individualistic for a reason, right? And people have this this desire to express themselves. And yet at the same time, you know, God tells us that we shouldn't cause our brothers or sisters to stumble, especially because we're in Christ, right?
Right.
And so if me dressing a certain way is causing another man, right, to, I don't know, commit adultery in their mind, right, desire after me, then I shouldn't cause them to stumble, right? And this is kind of what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians when he says, like, if me eating meat, consuming meat causes another brother to stumble, then I will never eat meat again, right? And there's a context behind this, but just for the sake of like time, I'm kind of skipping over that. But you know, the point is, he's kind of saying like, you know, if me doing a certain something, you know, causes someone to sin, to stumble, then I will never do it ever again. And I think that's the spirit behind these sorts of passages where, you know, I don't think that Paul is saying women are beneath men. Right?
No, absolutely not.
Yeah. And also, this also brings up another point, how, you know, Christ was, Jesus was God's son. And how do I explain this?
Christ is a groom, the church is a bride.
Yeah, that definitely does also. Mm-hmm. You know, I think that what was I going to say? Well, you know, I think Christ was the son and God was the father, but Christ was not less than God. You know, they were both God. They were at the same quote unquote level, right? I think this, and the only thing was that they had different functions, different roles. So like God, the Father, Jesus Christ, the Son, and the Spirit, they're all equal in terms of like divinity, etc. But they're unequal in the sense that they have different functions, right? Yeah. I think the same is being implied when Paul says things like that. I think men and women, they're equal in terms of worth, but in terms of function, they're different. Socially, biologically, and things like that. So I think it really, whether you accept this message or not, it really depends on the lens through which you view it. And I think that God gives us the wisdom that allows us to be able to accept this kind of difficult message. You know? So,
I love how you put that, because, you know, I've talked to Jasmine about this, my wife about this a lot of different times. And obviously it's a tough conversation to have with women if you're a man in general either. It's trying to
I'm sure.
have a conversation about, this is why you should submit to me. Like, but I think the biggest takeaway, and exactly to your point, as that passage has nothing to do with women are below men.
No.
The value of each individual creation that God's created, we are all equally valued by him. He saved each and every single one of us, because ultimately we are the same value, and we are just as worthless as we are valuable to God. Like, you know?
Oh, that's an interesting,
and,
interesting thought.
But with the husband and wife situation, I think the reason why some women get offended is because they're not actually understanding what it means to be a leader either, like of the household, of like what it truly means to be the head of the household. That they think that that's some sort of authoritative, patriarchal, like, oh, okay, he's a leader, so I have to just do what he says. But no, it's a binding and very cohesive, like, contract, and there's a covenant that's made between man and wife, just as Christ is the head and the church is the bride. And as Christ died for the church, and that he served the church because he was obviously the leader. He was the one that truly understood what it meant to be the true kind of the epitome of what it means to lead. He showed that by not being some sort of aristocratic or authoritative or dictatorship or, you know, overbearing a political fashion. He did it simply by becoming a servant to his people. That not only did he truly teach people stuff, but he served them in a genuine way. And I think what it means to be a leader is exactly that. Like, you're there to serve more than you are there to lead. And I liked how somebody put this, that if you're an alpha, people often mistake that with the fact that like alpha, like, and they have this negative connotation. But if you look at how alphas move, especially in a wolf pack, they're at the back. They're letting the old and the sick
Yeah,
in
I
front
didn't know that. Yeah.
so that they can walk at their pace, and he protects them from behind. So people have this weird conception of alpha, and I mean, the alpha male perspective. I don't really, I don't like that.
Stupid.
Yeah. But
yeah,
because I used to consider myself an alpha too.
Oh,
and so,
really?
and
Oh,
so,
oops.
beta, like, and like, I mean, no, not oops. It's a narrow-minded way of thinking, in my opinion. Now, like that you like kind of distinguish yourself like that. But the point is, like with the leadership aspect, is that not only is the woman submitting because of the fact that the husband is leading in the correct way of leading, that he is truly serving the household, as well as understanding that, okay, not only am I serving, but I have to ensure that I am the provider and the protector, that like I can truly make sure that she has a reason to give that submission.
That's right.
It's not some sort of forced submission. It's a willing submission.
Sorry, I was gonna say that reminded me of why I was bringing up Jesus Christ and his relation to the Father. Oftentimes in the Bible it says that Jesus submitted to the Father.
Right. Yeah.
Submission to the Father. Right. But that did not imply that he was any less than God was. And so I that's all this is to say that I agree that I think people have a mistaken conception, misconception of what submission is in a Christian view. So, like to submit to someone, right, isn't necessarily to be less than them, right? If anything, I would say it's being the bigger person. Not to not to say women are better, but for instance, right? Like for instance, I think it's similar with like I think it's similar to like when Jesus was mocked and like beaten and spat at and stuff, he allowed that to happen, right? He could have defended himself. He could have tried and fight back, but he didn't, right? And
he could have very well fought back.
Yeah.
None of them had a chance if he really wanted to fight back.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that people can be the same way when we're being persecuted, right? We can choose to fight back, or we can choose to just sort of allow it to happen. And I think that act of submission, quote unquote, right? I think that speaks volumes about the kind of greatness this person has on the inside, right? And I think the same kind of applies to in a social role, right? Where someone submits to another person willingly and sort of like, where was I going with that? But yeah, and I had one other point, but I don't remember what it was.
What do you think about this, though? I just recently thought about, I just like kind of on the fly thought about this and want to get your opinion.
Sure.
And I think we should end here soon. Like,
sure,
this is the longest interview that I've ever had.
I am so sorry.
No, like I am sorry to you. Like usually I'm a lot more cognizant of the guest time. And
I'm totally fine.
Okay, all right, good, because I've been really enjoying this conversation.
Me too, All
right, but so I think one thing about submission and the leading aspect, I saw this thing about this Ninja Turtles theory. All right, so bear with me for a second. I
love where this is going.
But there's a reason why each of them have their weapon. And
really?
And it's just a theory. I think it's like a fan-made theory, but it makes a lot of sense. Like Raphael, for example, he has this sky or whatever those
I don't know
things.
what they're called, but I know what you're talking, like the little forks.
Yeah, the fork little thingamabobs and the thingamabobs. But anyway, everybody knows who Raphael is.
I love the verbiage that you use. Those dudes. Thingamabobs.
But he's the most hot-headed one. He has the worst temper. He potentially could become the most violent. And what weapon does he get? He gets the one that has literally no sharp edges, and it's strictly meant for defense. So he's not given a weapon to attack with. He's given something to defend with. So he's being taught to work on his worst attribute, the thing that he sucks at the most. And Michelangelo, he's very clutter-minded, but he has nunchucks. And nunchucks, you have to be extremely precise, so you're not rocking yourself in the head.
Yeah.
So you have to be very precise with your movements. So it's teaching him focus, be clear-headed. With Donatello, he's the smartest one in the entire group. And he has probably the ability to make all these fancy technologies to help them with their weapons. And he gets the giant stick.
Yeah.
You know? And Leonardo is the most compassionate. He's the one that really is unwilling to look to violence to solve his problems. He's always looking for that peace. And he's the only one with that has a weapon that can actually kill.
A sword, right?
Yeah, he has 2 katanas.
Yeah.
So and the reason why I bring this up is even within the submission and the leading aspect, I think there's something about how when you truly develop into those roles, like a woman truly submitting to her husband and a husband truly leading his household, the roles somewhat actually get in a way tangled and reversed, that because you understand that you're leading, you are more invested in how much you're serving. And it's, yes, that's what leading ultimately is. But if you truly get that, you're really becoming the servant. And with the wife is that by truly submitting to their husband, that they are allowing their husband to take that, and they are able to take on the role of a leadership that they otherwise would not be able to have.
So they're secretly the bosses. Sorry.
But the reason I brought up the Ninja Turtle theory is that, like, maybe because of the fact that we have these natural tendencies. That these are some things. These are the attributes we need to kind of work on the most in our roles. And in order for us to truly develop into our, like, I guess, design roles, or however you want to say it, when God's purpose for it is for us to truly work on the thing we suck at the most, because men want to really be that leader. Like they don't want to, they have this mistaken concept of what leadership is. They think it's just telling people what to do. So, but if you truly work on what leadership really is, then you become a servant. Whereas women, they hate to be led a lot of the times. But then when they truly understand that when a person is leading them right, they don't need to worry about anything like that. Like, and that they can truly actually walk in confidence through their life. And they can really walk like they are the boss. You know what I mean? And so I don't know. Like, that's just a thought I had.
No, I agree with you. I think that man tends to put certain types of prestige on certain types of titles, right? So, and I think the same applies to the term leader, or the term, like submission, right? Submission is like an act of weakness. Whereas, being the leader is like, you are the better person, the star of the show, I think that's all, maybe not all, but I think that's mostly, at least most of it, I think is sort of man-made emphasis, I think the focus should be more on the function or the role of that role, the name, right? So what is the function or the role of the leader, right? And it kind of takes away from the implied prestige that the term has. So, like you said, a leader's job, like functionally from a Christian point of view, I think, is to, guide people, right? Kind of protect people and ensure that, things are going smoothly.
Right.
And I think the the function of a supporter is to add on to that, right?
Mm.
Um, be a sort of resource, be a sort of pillar for that process.
Right.
Yeah. And so I think when we consider it in terms of role or function, it takes away from that, like, oh, this position is more prestigious. This position is more prestigious. Or less prestigious.
One without the other.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. At the end of the day, it's kind of like clockwork, where all the gears, they're not independently functioning. They're all working in tandem. They're all working together to make the bigger picture, the bigger thing work, Mm-hmm. And I think that's how we should consider it. It's not about the prestige, which, again, I think is kind of emphasized by man, I don't think God necessarily puts prestige on the role of men or the role of women. I think,
Mm-hmm.
if anything, Christianity was countercultural at the time in terms of womanhood, I guess, Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, yeah. They definitely didn't view women in the highest
exactly.
regard. Yeah.
I mean, women didn't really have much of a voice, but, and so it's probably easier for me to accept because I tend to be slightly more conservative. I don't mean just politically, which I don't really affiliate with any political party.
No, I know what you mean by you're conservative.
Yeah, I'm just more conservative. Yeah. But I say that because people tend to tie that term with politics, but I'm like, no,
right? Yeah,
please no.
There's such politics is a whole nother story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but anyway, it's probably easier for me to accept because I have a more conservative perspective. But I think, I don't disrespect people's opposing views, people who are upset by that, because the Bible isn't the goal of the Bible isn't like to coddle people. It's offensive. A lot of it is offensive.
Yeah.
And it's hard to deliver the word of God unoffensively because it is offensive. A lot of, especially in today's society.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I don't know. All these are just things that I've come to personally, understand.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully it was by God's grace and not my own understanding.
No, yeah. I mean, and just the fact that you have that perspective, I think, is a testament that it isn't by your own understanding. But ultimately, God's the only one who knows. And that's right, the whole point of that passage in Corinthians where we will be evaluated by our works,
Yeah.
And that's when that motivation and the intent will be clear. So all we can do is on a daily basis is to truly try to make that motivation and that intention as pure as possible for God and for his glory. And, and definitely it's hard, but I think with the right foundation, and this is the reason why a fellowship is so important, having a strong, group of believers that you're talking about the faith with, and not always in some sort of like, well, what does this doctrine mean? Like, or what does this mean? Like, it's like actually just talk about God, and be surprised at where that would go, considering that
I know,
we've been talking for 3 hours now, which is like, like I said, like I've just been like, I hope she's not thinking like I'm just holding her here.
No. Actually, if it came across that way, I know I checked my phone a couple of times. It was because I was getting calls from someone.
No, I saw that. Yeah. But it's just.
If anything, I was like, stop calling me.
But this is this kind of a testament in itself as we're just talking about God. And
thanks for giving me an opportunity to
thank you for sharing. Like it was a very powerful story, and I really I was moved in a lot of different ways. It's
it was my very long testimony. That's probably why it took so much time.
No, I'm glad that you went into it and you know, that you were willing to be vulnerable enough to share the details of it.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
sometimes we try to skim through our testimonies and stuff like that. Like the journey to God isn't some like 15-minute like oh yeah, this like they have this like storyline. You know,
No,
sometimes it's a long road.
Yeah. I actually felt bad because I realized that I talked mostly about myself and not really about how Christ changed me. But I did that intentionally because I was like, oh man, I'm like talking forever. Like I need to just stop, you know? But then I was like, oh wait, I talked about myself and like, you know, anyway, yeah.
No, hey,
I just thought it was funny. But,
no, you shouldn't worry about that. And to have an understanding, I think, of how Christ even works, sometimes you have to share your specific story.
Yeah,
like
that's
sometimes
right,
you know, it's not like when I was 5-year-old, this was how God was working in my life. That seems a little less believable than
that's true.
you
Yeah,
actually sharing your story. You know what I mean? And I think that's another thing too. It's like when we talk about God, that doesn't necessarily mean we can't talk about our own lives.
Yeah,
we share in our experiences, we share in our struggles, we share in our joys.
That's right.
I love the passage where it talks about, you know, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn. You know, so we're there for each other in all these different circumstances. And it's just been an awesome conversation with you.
Oh yeah.
Thank you for joining me today, and should definitely have more conversations like this.